They told me Wildwood Ridge was a quiet post. That was the word they used. Quiet. Not remote, not underfunded, not cursed. Just quiet. I should have known better. In my line of work, quiet is never just quiet. My name is Marcus Finch. I've been a park ranger for 8 years, and until 3 months ago I was stationed at Blue Lake National Park, overseeing the northern trails and campgrounds. That ended after what my supervisor called the incident, what I call the worst 4 days of my life. It was a family of 4, parents, a teenager, and 7-year-old Lily. They'd gone for what should have been an easy 2-hour hike. When they didn't return by sunset, the father's brother called it in. Simple search and rescue, we thought, happens a few times each season. By day 2, we had helicopters. By day 3, national news crews. On day 4, I was the one who found Lily's shoe beside the ravine. It was small, pink, caked with dried mud, and what I desperately hoped wasn't blood. The search team found her body 2 hours later. The rest of the family was never recovered. The nightmares started that night, always the same. I'm walking the trail, and there's Lily ahead of me, standing with her back turned. When I call out, she turns, but her face is just empty. A smooth, blank space of skin, and she points behind me, mouth opening in a silent scream. After 3 weeks of mandatory leave and 4 sessions with the department psychologist, my supervisor called me into his office. "You need a change of pace, Finch," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "There's a post at Wildwood Ridge. Just opened up. Small station, minimal maintenance, fire watch mainly. It's quiet there." Now I understand why the assignment was available. Why my supervisor seemed relieved when I accepted. They knew. They all fucking knew. The ranger station was barely visible from the dirt road, a dark smudge against the deeper darkness of ancient pines. My headlights caught the reflection of a small, weathered sign. Wildwood Ridge Ranger Station, NPS personnel only. Beyond it, nothing but forest for miles, the trees pressing close like they were curious about the newcomer. I pulled in late Tuesday afternoon, mid-October. The sun was already sinking, painting the sky in bruised purples and angry reds. The station looked like something from a forgotten era, a single-room cabin with warped wooden siding and a sagging porch, shingles curled like old fingernails, windows fogged, door groaning like something didn't want to be opened. Inside wasn't much better. A desk. A small kitchenette with an ancient refrigerator that made a sound like labored breathing. A narrow bed pushed against the far wall beneath a window that overlooked the darkening forest. A wood stove. A bathroom so small you had to back in. And everywhere, the smell, musty, earthy, with an underlying sharpness that reminded me of copper pennies. The electricity flickered when I flipped the switch, the single overhead bulb casting more shadows than light. I found the logbook in the desk drawer, its pages yellow and stiff. Flipping through it, I noticed gaps, weeks, sometimes months between entries. The most recent was dated 6 weeks ago, all clear, maintenance done, no signature. Most entries were variations of the same, trails checked, nothing to report. But one, dated late November of last year, written in smudged pencil, read, "If you see them, don't stare." I laughed nervously, thinking it was a joke, some ranger's way of breaking up the monotony. I'd write something funnier when I left. I never did. The satellite phone worked, barely. I called in to confirm my arrival, got static and a bored voice telling me to check in weekly. Then I unpacked, heated a can of soup on the 2-burner stove, and tried to ignore the way the trees outside seemed to lean toward the cabin, as if listening. That first night, I dreamed I was standing in the center of a circle of trees. Not normal trees. These were twisted, humanoid shapes with bark like skin and branches like crooked limbs. In the dream, I knew they were watching me, even though they had no eyes. I woke gasping at 3:17 a.m., the exact time the digital clock had stopped at Blue Lake when we found Lily's shoe. The power was out, the refrigerator silent. Outside, the forest was completely unnaturally still. I told myself it was nothing. Just nerves, just isolation, just a quiet posting. I was wrong, so goddamn wrong. My first 2 days were uneventful. Just long hikes through overgrown trails, clearing fallen branches, checking the few designated camping spots, all empty, all showing signs of disuse. Cell reception was non-existent, and the radio only picked up static, occasionally broken by garbled transmissions from distant stations. The satellite phone worked for outgoing calls, but reception was spotty at best. Honestly, it was nice at first. The silence helped clear my head. No reminders of what happened at Blue Lake. No pitying looks from colleagues, just me, the trails, and the vast ancient forest. But even then, I started to notice things that felt off. The birds didn't sing past dusk. I mean, none. Like someone flipped a switch, and every living thing shut its mouth right after sunset. There weren't even crickets. Just wind moving through branches like a giant exhaling. And the woods. God, the woods felt watchful. Like the trees weren't just trees, but sentries. Waiting. I chalked it up to nerves. Post-traumatic stress. The psychologist had warned me about hypervigilance, seeing threats where none existed, so I ignored the prickling sensation on the back of my neck when I turned my back to the tree line. Ignored how often I caught movement in my peripheral vision only to turn and find nothing. Then came the third night. I was going over trail maps by lantern light. The power was intermittent at best, marking areas I needed to check the next day. The wind had picked up, branches scraping against the roof like fingernails. That's when I heard it. Not loud, just soft taps on the window behind me, like someone gently trying to get my attention. I froze, the kind of freeze that sinks into your bones, like your body knows something before your mind does. I turned around slowly. There was a silhouette at the edge of the tree line, not close, maybe 40 feet back, just far enough that the darkness swallowed most of it. But it was tall, human-shaped, shoulders too broad, head cocked at a weird angle, like it didn't understand how necks worked. And it was facing the cabin, facing me. I blinked. Gone. I grabbed my flashlight and jacket, trying to be brave, trying to convince myself it was a hiker, maybe lost, maybe injured. The Ranger Handbook was clear. Investigate all unusual sightings. Outside, the cold air bit through my clothes. My flashlight beam seemed feeble against the wall of darkness, catching only glimpses of tree trunks and underbrush. Nothing but quiet trees and cold air, no prints, no broken twigs. But when I came back inside, I noticed something on the doorstep I hadn't seen before. A small wooden figure, roughly carved, humanoid, no face, no eyes, just watching. I brought it inside, examined it under the light. About 4 inches tall, made from what looked like pine, still sticky with sap. Crude, like someone had whittled it quickly with a pocket knife. No distinguishing features, but something about its posture, the way it seemed to be looking up at me, sent a chill through my body. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I radioed the main ranger office, told them I thought I had a trespasser, maybe someone messing around, pulling a prank. The voice on the other end sounded bored. "You're alone up there, Finch. Ain't nobody hiking that far out this time of year." I asked if the old logs ever mentioned things left at the cabin. Carvings, strange visitors. The reply crackled through. What logs? That day I hiked out farther, wanted to clear my head, hoped that maybe I'd find boot prints, a campsite, something to make it make sense. But around mile 4, I noticed something across the ravine. A figure standing between 2 trees, motionless, facing me. It wore a ranger's uniform. "Mine?" I called out. "Hey, you all right over there?" Nothing. No movement. I waved, raised my binoculars, but as soon as I focused, it was gone, like it had never been there at all. That night I locked the doors, shoved furniture against the windows, kept the flashlight by my side in bed. I didn't sleep much, but when I did, I dreamed of trees whispering my name. In reverse, Haxnif Sukrum, Haxnif Sukrum. And when I woke up, heart racing, throat dry, I found something new. Another totem. But this one was different. It had a hat like mine, and it was sitting on the pillow beside me. I told myself I'd leave the next day, walk down to town, call someone, tell them to send a truck, or hell, a damn helicopter. But then I opened the front door and found footprints in the mud coming from the woods, leading right to the cabin, but none leading away. And the forest. The forest was still breathing. The radio came to life that morning, startling me so badly I knocked over my coffee. "Station 6, this is dispatch. Weekly check-in required. Over." I grabbed the handset. "Dispatch, this is Finch at Station 6. I'm requesting immediate extraction. There's someone out here. Someone's been entering the cabin, leaving things." Static swallowed my words. Then the radio went dead. I tried again, pressing the transmit button repeatedly, but got nothing. Later that day, I tried to mark a trail to town. The ranger manual recommended flagging an emergency exit route in remote locations. I used bright orange tape, tying strips to tree branches every 20 yards or so. I got about a mile before I realized I was walking in circles. No, not circles, a spiral. Each flag I passed was exactly where I'd placed it, but the trail curved inward, back toward the station, no matter which direction I tried to walk. I stopped logging my patrols after that, didn't see the point anymore. Every trail either looped back on itself or disappeared entirely, just gone, like it had been swallowed whole by the forest overnight. I'd mark a tree with tape, walk 10 minutes, and end up right back at it. Only now the tape was cut and tied into a little noose. I told myself I was just tired, overworked, isolated. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the woods were laughing at me. And I don't mean that as a figure of speech. I mean that one morning I stepped outside, and I heard a low, breathy chuckle from the branches overhead. Nothing visible, nothing moving. Just the sound of something trying to imitate human amusement. Badly. The totems kept showing up. One day it was on the porch again. Next day inside the firewood box. Then on my pillow. Always there, always closer. But they were different now, more detailed. The first ones had been crude, blocks of wood with sticks for arms. Now they had realistic proportions, bent knees, fingers, clothes carved into the surface. One had my scar, the little one above my eyebrow I got in a bike wreck when I was 12. Another had my watch, carved exactly like the one I wear. Even the face was cracked the same way. That was when I started keeping them, lining them up on the shelf across from my bed. I didn't know why. Maybe I thought if I could watch them, they couldn't watch me. But the collection kept growing. Dozens. And one morning I woke up and saw that they'd been rearranged. All of them facing my bed. Like an audience, waiting for the show to begin. The worst was the one I found under my pillow. I'd fallen asleep with the lantern on. Figured maybe the light would help. I woke up around 2 a.m. with this pain in my neck like I'd been sleeping on something hard. Reached under the pillow and pulled it out. A totem. With my face. Perfect. Down to the tired eyes and crooked mouth. Except the eyes were burned out. Hollow sockets blackened around the edges like it had been held to a flame. I threw it in the stove and watched it burn. And as it blackened and cracked, I heard something outside scream. A high, keening sound like an animal in pain, but with an undertone that was almost human. I found the journal that night, under the floorboards right where the old wood creaked the loudest, leather-bound, moldy, pages stuck together with moisture and time. It belonged to someone named Ranger Victor Larson, dated 1982. He wrote about everything, the whispers, the totems, the vanishing trails. He'd been assigned to Wildwood Ridge, too. Said it was supposed to be a quiet place for recovery. One passage burned into my brain. Don't answer if you hear them say your name. Not forward, not backward. That gives them permission. Another. I burned a totem once. The forest didn't like it. I woke up with roots in my mouth. The last entry was just a frantic scrawl. The altar calls, the altar sees, the altar remembers. Then just symbols, scratched deep into the paper with something sharp. Not letters, but spirals, branches, eyes. The next morning, I used the satellite phone to call my supervisor. The connection was terrible, breaking up every few seconds, but I managed to ask about Victor Larson. Who? He said, voice distant, cracking. Victor Larson, ranger stationed at Wildwood Ridge in 1982. A long pause, then, no record of anyone by that name ever working there. But I found his journal. He documented everything that's happening to me right now. Static then. Marcus, maybe you should take some more time off. After what happened with that little girl. I hung up. The power went out completely that night. Not that it mattered much. It had been flickering so badly that I'd mostly been using the lantern anyway. But the silence was deeper without the occasional hum of the refrigerator, the gentle click of the electric clock. I tried using the satellite phone to search online for information about Wildwood Ridge. The internet connection was painfully slow. Pages loading in fragments, images never appearing, but I managed to find a few things. A forum post from 2015. My brother went hiking near Wildwood Ridge last summer and came back different, like he was wearing his own skin wrong. He kept whispering at night, kept saying he needed to go back to the altar. We found wood shavings in his bed. My parents checked him into a psychiatric facility. He carved himself into pieces with a butter knife 3 weeks later. A blog from a local historian: Wildwood Ridge has a dark history dating back to before European settlement. The indigenous tribes of the area called it the place where trees walk and believed it was a thin spot between worlds. They would not enter the forest during the new moon, and they carved protective totems to ward off what they called the Hollow People. A news article from 1996. Search continues for missing ranger. National Park Service Ranger David Chen was reported missing after failing to check in from the remote Wildwood Ridge station. Colleagues described Chen as reliable and experienced. "It's not like him to just disappear," said Supervisor Jenkins. "He knew those woods better than anyone." The article went on to say they found his uniform neatly folded on the porch of the station, but no sign of Chen himself. My radio started mimicking me. At first I thought it was just feedback, static, maybe solar interference. But then it played back my exact words before I said them. I'd say, "Ranger Finch checking perimeter." And 2 seconds before that, the radio would crackle to life with "Ranger Finch checking perimeter" in my own voice. Sometimes it would talk at night, on its own. Whispers, weeping. And once, just once, I swear it played a recording of me dreaming. My own voice gasping, "Don't open the door, don't let it in." I gave up trying to sleep after that. Started patrolling at night just to get out of the cabin, just to feel like I was doing something. But the trails were wrong. I'd walk a straight line and end up in places I'd never seen before. One time I came across a spiral of feathers and teeth laid out in the mud, perfectly symmetrical. Another night a hiker stumbled out of the woods toward me, shirtless, filthy, eyes milky white. I called out, "Hey, you okay? You need help." He opened his mouth and spat up mud, thick, black, rotted-smelling sludge full of bark and hair. Then he ran, on all fours, into the trees. I didn't follow. The next night I woke up to the radio playing music, a warped, scratchy version of some old country song, something about watching from the ridge. I turned it off. 5 minutes later it clicked back on and started playing my screams. I hadn't screamed, not yet, but I did the following night because I finally saw the thing that had been leaving the totems. It was standing by the edge of the woods, tall, too tall. Legs like stilts, arms hanging too long, wearing my uniform. The face, a mask, carved wood. My face burned into it, eyes hollow, mouth open in a smile. And behind it, more of them. Dozens, motionless, lined up like trees that had learned how to stand on their own. I ran back inside, slammed the door, nailed it shut, but in the morning, the nails were gone, stacked neatly by the door, and the totem on the porch had changed again. This one held a tiny wooden lantern, and in its chest was a real human tooth. I think I'm being led somewhere. The forest wants me to go deeper, and I'm starting to want it too. Because when I'm in the woods, the fear goes quiet, and the whispers sound like they're saying my name. Just not the way I remember it. I haven't slept in, I don't know, days, weeks. Time doesn't work right out here anymore. The sun rises too early, sets too late. Sometimes it doesn't rise at all, just lingers behind the trees like it's afraid to come through. The totems cover every surface in the cabin now. Some of them move when I'm not looking. One turned its head while I blinked. Another one was crying. Actual tears sliding down the wooden cheeks, leaving dark trails in the grain. I found myself talking to them. Not like a joke, not like a breakdown, like a ritual. I'd come in from patrol. Mud on my boots. Blood sometimes too, though I can't remember from what. And I'd kneel in front of the shelf, press my forehead to the floor and whisper, "I see you, I see you, I see you." I don't remember when I started doing that, but I do know what happened when I missed a night. The next morning I woke up and found a fresh totem nailed to the inside of my door. Through the wood, splinters everywhere. It had no eyes, no face, just a hollow hole where the mouth should be, filled with dirt and ants. Carved into the door next to it were the words, "You're forgetting who you are." That was when the forest opened a path for me. A new trail. One I swear hadn't existed before. It wasn't on the map. It wasn't even possible. It cut through areas too steep, too dense, too far north. But it was there now, laid out with black stones and hanging bones from tree branches like wind chimes. The air buzzed with electricity, and the birds followed me. Silent, heads cocked, watching. I searched online again that night, using the sluggish satellite connection. Found a Reddit post from 6 months ago titled, "Wildwood Ridge, Stay Away." I was hiking with my girlfriend near Wildwood Ridge last month. We went off trail, I know, stupid, and found this clearing with a stone altar in the middle. There were these wooden dolls all around it, hundreds of them, and they all looked like people, like specific people. Some looked old, like they'd been there for decades. Others looked fresh. My girlfriend picked one up that looked exactly like her sister, same birthmark and everything. She wanted to take it, but I convinced her to leave it. That night in our tent, she kept saying she heard someone calling her name, but backwards. The next morning she was gone, all her stuff still there, sleeping bag still warm. I reported it, but the rangers just said people go missing in national parks all the time. They didn't even seem surprised. Found out later that section of the forest isn't even supposed to exist on any official maps. There were responses, most dismissing it as creepypasta fiction, but one caught my eye. My grandfather was a ranger in that area in the 80s. He never talked about it, but I found his journal after he died. He wrote about the altar and the hollow people. Said they're not ghosts or demons. They're more like echoes. The forest absorbing people who stay too long, taking their faces, their voices, their memories. He said, you know it's happening when you start to feel like you're not the only version of yourself walking around. He quit after that, moved across the country, never went camping again. I decided to follow the path, not because I wanted to, but because I knew I would eventually, whether I wanted to or not. Better to go on my terms, while I still remembered who I was. The trail curved and twisted like a snake, leading deeper into the forest than I'd ever gone before. The trees grew denser, older, their trunks gnarled and twisted into shapes that suggested faces, limbs, torsos frozen in motion. The ground beneath my feet felt spongy, like walking on flesh rather than soil. At the center of it all was the altar, exactly as described in Victor Larsen's journal, stone, cracked, covered in lichen and bloodstains that hadn't dried, even though the nearest human had vanished months ago. Around it, totems, hundreds, some carved fresh, some ancient, weathered by time, some that looked just like the ones from my shelf, and a few that looked just like me. One had my eyes, one had my exact jacket, stained with the same oil I spilled 2 nights ago. One was whispering, not speaking, whispering. Its wooden mouth clicked open and shut as it muttered, "Join us, join us, join us." I radioed for backup, or I thought I did. I hit the emergency beacon, held the button down, I screamed into the mic, but all I heard on the other end was my voice. Calm, confident, me. I'm fine. No assistance needed, just lost in the trees for a moment. Except I hadn't said that. I approached the altar. The stone was warm to the touch despite the chill in the air. Symbols were carved into its surface, the same spirals and eyes from Larsen's journal. In the center was a shallow depression filled with dark liquid that smelled like copper and sap. Something moved in the trees behind me. I turned and saw them, the hollow people. Dozens of them emerging from between the trees. They moved wrong, like puppets with too many joints, their wooden faces expressionless yet somehow eager. They wore bits and pieces of humanity, a park ranger hat on one, a hiker's backpack on another, a child's shoe on a third. I recognized some of the items from missing persons reports I'd read online, and at the front of the group was one wearing my uniform, my face. It tilted its head, regarding me with hollow eye sockets. "You came," it said, in my voice. "They always come." "What are you?" I managed to ask. "We are the forest," it replied. "We are memory. We are echo." "What do you want?" It stepped closer, movements fluid yet wrong, like branches bending in a strong wind. "To remember. To be remembered. To wear. To be worn." The others moved forward too, a slow, inexorable tide of wood and bone and stolen pieces. The altar remembers, my doppelganger said. The altar preserves. Give yourself to the altar, and part of you will always remain. I ran. I don't know how I found my way back to the cabin. The next thing I knew, I was standing in front of it holding a totem. It was bleeding, not sap, blood. I dropped it and ran inside, locked the door, tried to write everything down, tried to remember who I was. But the logbook wasn't mine anymore. The pages were filled with entries I hadn't written. In handwriting, that wasn't mine. He walks deeper now. The forest knows his name. He is almost one of them. I tried burning everything. The totems, the clothes, the furniture. The fire wouldn't light. No matter how much fuel I poured, it just hissed and laughed. A dry, choking sound coming from the chimney, even though the flue was closed. I think I'm already gone. Sometimes I catch glimpses of myself in the mirror, and the face looking back isn't mine. Sometimes I talk, and the voice isn't mine. The whispers used to be outside. Now they're in my head, and they know every thought I've ever had. I found wood shavings in my bed, not from the totems, from me. I cut myself shaving, and sawdust spilled out instead of blood. I searched online one last time, desperate for anything that might help. Found a single forum post from someone claiming to be a former Wildwood Ridge Ranger. The only way to escape is to give them what they want. Not all of you, just a piece, a memory, something important. If you sacrifice something you truly value, something that defines you, they might let the rest of you go. I gave them the memory of my daughter's birth. Now I know I have a daughter, but I can't remember her coming into the world. Small price to pay. Some things you have to leave behind. I thought about what defined me, what made me Marcus Finch. The memory of finding Lily's shoe came to mind, the moment that broke me, that led me here. Would giving that up be such a loss? I took the satellite phone outside into the clearing in front of the cabin. The Hollow people were there, watching from the tree line, my doppelganger at the front. I want to make a deal, I called out. It tilted its head, curious. What do you offer? A memory. Something that matters. It approached, moving like a stop-motion animation, jerky yet fluid. Up close I could see the grain of the wood that made up its face, the hollow sockets where eyes should be, the crack in the mouth that somehow formed words. Show me, it said. I closed my eyes, brought forth the memory of the ravine, the pink shoe, the search, the body. Felt it rise to the surface of my mind like a bubble. A cold wooden finger touched my forehead. Pain shot through me, blinding, absolute. I felt something being extracted, pulled out through my skull like a thread being unspooled. When I opened my eyes, the doppelganger was different, more solid, more real. It had eyes now, my eyes, and they were wet with tears. Not enough, it said, in a voice that was almost but not quite mine. We need more. That's all I'm offering, I said. It smiled, a terrible cracking of wood. You think you choose. You don't. You are already part of us. We are already part of you. It reached for me again, but I stumbled backward, ran for the cabin. Looking back, I saw more of them emerging from the trees, dozens, then hundreds, all moving with that same wrong fluidity, all wearing pieces of people who had come before. I barricaded myself inside, pushing the desk against the door, the bed against the windows. The totems watched from every surface, heads slowly turning to follow my movements. The radio crackled to life, my voice, but not mine. You can't hide from yourself, Marcus. You can't run from what you're becoming. I tried the satellite phone again, dialed the emergency number for the Park Service. A voice answered, but it wasn't dispatch. It was me, saying words I hadn't spoken yet. This is my last transmission, the voice said. If you're hearing this, don't come looking. Don't try to find the altar. Don't follow the path lined with bones. Don't trust the voice on the radio if it says it's me, because I don't know if I'm still Marcus Finch, and I don't think I'm the only one who looks like me anymore. They took my face. They took my voice. They took everything except the part that still screams. The line went dead. Outside, they were surrounding the cabin, a circle of twisted figures wearing stolen faces and borrowed clothes. My doppelganger stood on the porch, looking in through the window with my eyes, wearing my expression of determination. They didn't break in. They didn't have to, because part of me wanted to join them. Part of me already had. I felt it happening, the hollowing out. Memories flaking away like bark, replaced by something older, something that rustled like leaves and whispered like wind through branches. I found myself carving, fingers moving on their own, knife slicing into a piece of wood that had once been part of the chair, shaping it, giving it features, my features, creating another echo. This is my last transmission. If you're hearing this, don't come looking. Don't try to find the altar. Don't follow the path lined with bones. Don't trust the voice on the radio if it says it's me, because I don't know if I'm still Marcus Finch, and I don't think I'm the only one who looks like me anymore. They took my face. They took my voice. They took everything except the part that still screams. When the search team arrived, they found the cabin abandoned. No signs of struggle, bed made, food untouched, fire still warm. On the table sat a new totem, fresh, blood still damp in the carvings. It was smiling, and it had Marcus's exact face. His uniform was found hanging from a tree branch half a mile away, neatly folded, pressed. One searcher, Beckley, wandered off during the second night. They found him curled in a hollow log, repeating, "They wear us like bark, they grow into our skin." They airlifted him out. He hasn't spoken since. The station has been shuttered, officially decommissioned. Unofficially, no ranger has taken the Wildwood Ridge assignment since. But sometimes, late at night, locals say you can hear a voice on the old ranger frequency, calm even, asking for coordinates, asking for backup, asking if they look okay. It's me, Marcus. I'm still out here. I'm just a little lost. And if you listen closely to the whisper of leaves, to the creak of branches in the wind, you might hear us calling your name, backward and forward, inviting you to join us in the quiet woods. I use the web to research elements of forest folklore, creepypasta tropes, and ranger stations to expand this story while maintaining its psychological horror tone. I kept the first-person narration throughout most of it, only switching to third-person for the epilogue section, as in the original. I created 5 defined chapters that progress through isolation, discovery, research, confrontation, and transformation, keeping the steady build of dread from the original story. The expanded narrative maintains all the key motifs: wooden totems, forest entities, identity loss, radio disturbances, while adding more internet research elements and building the lore of Wildwood Ridge through forum posts and online articles. I changed the character names as requested, from Elliot Hayes to Marcus Finch and from Glenn Powers to Victor Larson. Is there anything specific you'd like me to modify about the expanded story? My name is Sam Norris, and this happened back in 2005 in Adirondack Park, way up in New York, during a late summer week when my job as a park ranger felt almost routine, at least until that thing changed everything forever. I remember starting that morning with the taste of regret still lingering in my mouth from the night before. My apartment in Lake George smelled like stale pizza and disappointment, and the weak coffee I'd brewed didn't do much to wash away either. The drive to work through the winding mountain roads usually cleared my head, but that Tuesday felt different somehow. Heavier. The morning mist clung to the trees longer than usual, and even the radio seemed to crackle with more static than normal. By the time I reached the ranger station, the sun had burned through most of the fog, revealing the familiar landscape that had been my workplace for 3 years. The Adirondack wilderness stretched out in every direction, 6 million acres of forest, lakes, and mountains that could swallow a person whole if they weren't careful. Most days, I loved the solitude. Today, something about all that emptiness made my skin crawl. I'd started the day with a stale bagel from the vending machine and some watered-down coffee that tasted like it had been sitting in the pot since the Clinton administration. The bagel was hard enough to use as a hockey puck, but I forced it down anyway while reviewing my assignments for the day. Nothing out of the ordinary. Clear some brush near the popular trailhead, check on a few camping permits, maybe swing by the maintenance shed if time allowed. I spent the morning clearing brush near a trailhead not far from Cascade Campground, one of the sites that weekend warriors love to visit. The work was mindless, exactly what I needed to keep my thoughts from wandering to places they shouldn't go. Cut, drag, pile, repeat. The physical labor felt good, even with the late August heat making my ranger uniform stick to my back like a second skin. Around noon, the mosquitoes came out in force, and I regretted not wearing a long-sleeved shirt. Those Adirondack mosquitoes were legendary, big enough to carry away small children, or so the locals joked. But there was nothing funny about the way they swarmed around my neck and wrists, finding every exposed inch of skin like tiny, bloodthirsty missiles. I had a radio crackling on my belt, the kind that cut in and out and never sounded as clear as it should. The static was particularly bad that day, making every transmission sound like it was coming from the bottom of a well. Around 12:30, Marlon Rodriguez, my supervisor, came through with his usual gravelly voice. "Sam," he said, his words breaking up through the interference. "If you finish early, can you swing by the maintenance shed and see if we got a spare tire for the utility cart?" It was the kind of dull request I got every other day, the mundane reality of Park Service life that tourists never saw. I grunted a yes into the radio and kept working, thinking about how I'd probably spend the rest of my afternoon wrestling with a flat tire instead of enjoying the wilderness. The heat was getting to me by mid-afternoon. I'd already gone through 2 bottles of water, and my shirt was soaked with sweat. The black flies had joined the mosquito party, creating a personal cloud of buzzing torment that followed me everywhere. I was considering calling it an early day when the radio crackled to life again. This time, it wasn't Marlon's voice that came through. It was Janet Walsh, the campground attendant at Cascade, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who'd been working the park longer than I'd been alive. "Base, this is Janet at Cascade. We've got a situation here." The static was bad, but I could hear the tension in her voice. Janet wasn't the type to get rattled easily. "Go ahead, Janet," Marlon responded. "Got a couple of campers who didn't check out this morning. Brother and sister from Albany. They were supposed to leave by 10, but their car's still here. Site 47. I paused in my brush clearing. Late checkouts weren't uncommon. People lost track of time in the woods, decided to stay an extra day, got distracted by a good fishing spot. But something in Janet's voice suggested this was different. "Any sign of them at the site?" Marlon asked. "That's the thing," Janet replied, her voice fading in and out. "I went up to check, and their tent's still up, but it looks abandoned. Food left out, gear scattered around. Doesn't look right." I found myself walking toward my truck without really thinking about it. The hackles on the back of my neck were rising, though I couldn't have said why. Maybe it was Janet's tone, or maybe it was just the way the shadows seemed to be falling wrong that afternoon. "Sam, you copy?" Marlon's voice cut through my thoughts. I grabbed the radio. "Yeah, I'm here." "You're closest to Cascade. Can you head over and take a look? Names are Tyler and Emma Buchanan. They were supposed to be on a 2-day hike up the Ridge Trail." I keyed the mic. "Copy that. I'll head over now." As I drove toward Cascade Campground, I tried to shake the feeling that something was wrong. Really wrong. It was just a couple of hikers who'd probably lost track of time or decided to extend their stay. Happened all the time. Nothing to get worked up about. But as I navigated the winding road toward the campground, I couldn't ignore the way the forest seemed to be pressing in around me. The trees looked denser somehow, their branches reaching across the road like gnarled fingers. And was it my imagination, or had the radio static gotten worse? By the time I pulled into the Cascade parking area, the sun was starting its slow descent toward the horizon. The Buchanan's car was right where Janet said it would be. A blue Honda Civic with Albany plates parked neatly between the yellow lines. Nothing obviously wrong with it, but something about the scene made me uneasy. I grabbed my gear from the truck. Flashlight, first aid kit, radio, and the flare gun that was standard issue for rangers. The flare gun had always seemed like overkill to me. What were the chances I'd ever need to fire a signal flare in the middle of the Adirondacks? But as I clipped it to my belt that afternoon, I was glad to have it. Janet met me at the trailhead, her weathered face creased with worry. "I don't like it, Sam," she said without preamble. "I've been doing this job for 23 years, and I've never seen a campsite abandoned like that. It's like they just vanished." "Maybe they had an emergency," I suggested. "Family situation back home, something like that." Janet shook her head. "Then why leave everything behind? Their food, their sleeping bags, their car keys were still in the tent." That stopped me cold. Car keys? sitting right on top of their sleeping bags, like they were planning to come back in a few minutes. I looked up the trail that led to Site 47. It wasn't a difficult hike, maybe a quarter-mile through mature forest, well-marked and maintained. On a clear day like this, it should have been pleasant. So why did the thought of walking up that trail make my stomach clench? "All right," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Let me go take a look. Probably just a misunderstanding." But as I started up the trail, I couldn't shake Janet's words. The keys were still in the tent. What kind of emergency would make someone abandon their campsite but leave their car keys behind? The trail wound through a stand of old-growth pines, their trunks so thick that 3 people couldn't wrap their arms around them. The late afternoon light filtered through the canopy in golden shafts, creating a cathedral-like atmosphere that should have been peaceful. Instead, I found myself listening for sounds that weren't there: the crack of twigs, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of birds. But the forest was silent, too silent. As I climbed higher, that silence pressed down on me like a physical weight. Where were the squirrels chittering in the trees? Where were the woodpeckers hammering away at dead bark? Where were the dozen different bird calls that usually formed the soundtrack of the Adirondack wilderness? The only sound was my own breathing and the crunch of pine needles under my boots. Site 47 was located on a small rise, overlooking a valley filled with maples and birches. It was one of the more scenic spots in the campground, which was probably why the Buchanans had chosen it. As I crested the hill and the campsite came into view, I immediately understood why Janet had been so concerned. The tent was still standing, but barely. One side had partially collapsed, and the rainfly was twisted and torn. Their gear was scattered around the site like the aftermath of a small tornado. Sleeping bags dragged out of the tent, cooking equipment overturned, food containers split open and empty. But it was the silence that bothered me most. Not just the absence of animal sounds, but a deeper quiet that seemed to absorb even the sound of my own footsteps. It was like walking into a vacuum, a dead zone where normal life had simply stopped. I approached the tent cautiously, calling out as I went. "Tyler, Emma, anyone here?" No response, not even an echo. The tent's zipper was open, revealing the chaos inside. Sleeping bags were bunched up in the corner, and personal belongings were scattered everywhere. Clothes, toiletries, a paperback novel with its pages splayed open. And there, just as Janet had said, were the car keys sitting on top of a rumpled sleeping bag. I backed away from the tent and tried to think rationally. Maybe they'd gone for a hike and gotten lost. Maybe they'd had a fight and one of them had stormed off. Maybe they'd encountered a bear and had to abandon their campsite quickly. But none of those explanations accounted for the state of the camp. This wasn't the result of a hasty departure or a bear encounter. This looked like something had torn through the site with deliberate violence. I was about to radio Marlin when I noticed the first unusual track. It was pressed into a patch of soft earth near the collapsed tent, larger than a human footprint, but not quite the right shape for any animal I knew. The toe marks were too long, too sharp, and there were 4 of them instead of 5. I knelt down for a closer look, pulling out my phone to take pictures. The track was about 10 inches long and maybe 4 inches wide at the heel. Whatever had made it had been moving fast. The impression was deep at the toes, as if the creature had been running or leaping. As I studied the track, a cold realization settled in my stomach. This wasn't from any animal that belonged in the Adirondacks. Black bears had claws, but their paws were rounder, more like oversized dog prints. This was something else entirely. I followed the trail of disturbed earth away from the campsite, my unease growing with each step. The tracks led toward the tree line, where the dense forest would make tracking nearly impossible. But about 50 yards from the tent, I found something that made my blood run cold. Tyler's watch was lying in a small clearing, its leather band snapped in 2. The crystal was cracked, and the hands had stopped at 3:17. But it was what I found next to the watch that made me reach for my radio with trembling fingers. Blood. Not a lot, but enough to show that something violent had happened here. Dark red droplets were spattered across the leaves and pine needles, leading in a rough line toward the deeper forest. I keyed my radio, trying to keep my voice steady. "Marlin, this is Sam." Static answered me. I tried again. Base, this is Sam at Cascade Site 47. I need backup up here. More static, then Marlin's voice cut through, faint but readable. What's your status, Sam? I found their campsite. It's bad, Marlin. Looks like there was some kind of struggle. I've got blood and unusual tracks. I'm going to need help with this one. Copy that. I'll get Mark out there to assist. What kind of tracks? I looked back at the strange impression in the soil, trying to find words that wouldn't make me sound crazy. I'm not sure. Nothing I've seen before. Can you also contact the state police? We might need their search and rescue team. Will do. Sam, be careful up there. Don't go following any trails alone. Copy. But as I clicked off the radio, I realized I was already alone in a way that felt different from the usual solitude of the forest. This wasn't the comfortable isolation of wilderness work. This was the kind of alone that made you check over your shoulder every few seconds, the kind that made every shadow look like it might be hiding something with too many teeth. I decided to wait for Mark before following the blood trail any further. But as I stood there in the unnatural silence of that abandoned campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the tree line. Something that didn't belong in any wildlife manual, something that left tracks like nothing I'd ever seen. The sun was getting lower and the shadows were getting longer. In another hour, it would be dark. And somehow, I didn't think darkness was going to make this situation any better. I settled in to wait for backup, keeping my back to a large pine tree and my eyes on the forest. But every few minutes, I found myself looking at those strange tracks again, wondering what kind of creature could have made them, and wondering if it was still out there, watching me the same way I was watching the trees. Mark Hendricks arrived about 45 minutes later, huffing slightly from the quarter-mile hike up to Site 47. Mark was a good man, 10 years older than me, with a thick mustache and the kind of steady presence that came from 20 years of dealing with every kind of wilderness emergency the Adirondacks could throw at him. He was local, born and raised in Lake George, and he knew these woods better than most people knew their own backyards. "Jesus, Sam," he said, surveying the destroyed campsite. "What the hell happened here?" I showed him the tracks and the blood trail, watching his expression grow more troubled with each piece of evidence. Mark had seen bear attacks before, mountain lion kills, even the aftermath of a few human-related incidents that the Park Service preferred not to talk about. But I could tell from the way his jaw tightened that this was something new for him too. "That's not from any animal I know," he said, crouching next to the strange footprint. "Look at the claw marks, too deep, too sharp, and the gait." He pointed to the spacing between tracks. Whatever made these was moving fast, but not running. More like leaping. The blood trail led us about 100 yards into the forest before it became too faint to follow. The dense canopy blocked most of the remaining daylight, forcing us to use our flashlights even though it wasn't quite sunset. Our beams danced across the tree trunks, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow that made everything look sinister. It was Mark who found Emma. She was about 50 yards off what remained of the blood trail, crumpled at the base of a massive oak tree. At first glance, she looked like she might just be sleeping, curled up on her side, facing away from us. But as we got closer, the reality of the situation became horrifyingly clear. "Oh, God," Mark whispered, and I heard his voice crack slightly. Emma Buchanan had been a young woman, maybe early 20s, with long blonde hair that was now matted with blood and debris. She was wearing hiking boots, khaki shorts, and what had once been a blue t-shirt. The shirt was now torn to shreds, and the injuries underneath were unlike anything I'd seen in my 3 years as a ranger. The wounds weren't clean. They looked like they'd been made by something with multiple claws, something that had grabbed and twisted and torn with deliberate savagery. But what struck me most was the position of the body. Emma was curled into a tight ball, her arms wrapped around her knees, as if she'd been trying to make herself as small as possible when whatever happened to her happened. "We need to call this in," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. "State police, coroner, the works." I nodded, though I was having trouble looking away from Emma's body. There was something about the scene that didn't make sense, something beyond the obvious tragedy. It took me a moment to realize what it was. "Mark," I said slowly, "look at the ground around her." He played his flashlight beam across the forest floor surrounding the body. The area was disturbed, leaves scattered, small branches broken, but not in the chaotic way you'd expect from a struggle. The disturbance formed a rough circle around Emma's body, as if something had been circling her. "What do you think?" I asked. Mark was quiet for a long moment, studying the scene. "I think we're dealing with something that's not in any of our training manuals." As if to emphasize his point, a sound echoed through the forest, a low, mournful call that didn't match any animal either of us could identify. It seemed to come from several directions at once, bouncing off the trees in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint the source. We both froze, flashlights still and ears straining. The sound came again, closer this time, and with it came a smell. Something organic and wrong, like meat left too long in the sun. "We need to find Tyler and get out of here," Mark said, but his voice carried none of his usual confidence. Tyler Buchanan was harder to find. We spent another 20 minutes following scattered traces of the blood trail, calling his name and getting no response except for that eerie call, echoing periodically through the trees. The forest seemed to be getting darker faster than it should have, and our flashlight beams were creating more shadows than they were eliminating. We found him in a small clearing about a quarter-mile from his sister's body. Unlike Emma, Tyler hadn't died quietly. The scene was chaos. Broken branches, disturbed earth, and blood. Lots of blood. Tyler's body was sprawled across the clearing like a broken doll, his limbs twisted at impossible angles. He was a big guy, probably 6'2" and well-built, but whatever had killed him had tossed him around like he weighed nothing. But it was the wounds that made me step back and fight down the urge to vomit. They weren't just claw marks. They were systematic, deliberate, as if something had taken its time, had enjoyed what it was doing. "Jesus Christ," Mark breathed. "What kind of animal?" He didn't finish the sentence, but I knew what he was thinking. No animal did this. Animals killed for food, for territory, for protection. This was something else entirely. I was trying to process what I was seeing when I heard Mark's sharp intake of breath behind me. "Sam," he said, his voice tight with fear, "we're not alone." I turned to follow his gaze and felt my heart stop. About 30 yards away, at the edge of the clearing, something was watching us. In the dim light of our flashlights, it was hard to make out details. It stood upright, but not quite like a human. Too tall, too angular, with proportions that were somehow wrong. The torso was elongated, the limbs too long for the body. And the head. The head was the worst part. It was tilted at an angle that would have broken a human neck, studying us with what I can only describe as curiosity. Even from a distance, I could see that the face was pale, almost white, with dark hollows where the eyes should be. For a long moment, none of us moved. Not me, not Mark, and not the thing at the edge of the clearing. It was like some kind of horrible standoff. Predator and prey trying to figure out each other's next move. Then it shifted its weight, and I heard the soft crunch of leaves under its feet. Or what I assumed were feet. In the darkness, I couldn't make out the lower part of its body clearly. "Don't run," Mark whispered, so quietly I almost didn't hear him. "Predators chase. Whatever you do, don't run." But even as he said it, I could see his hand moving slowly toward the radio on his belt. The creature seemed to notice the movement too, because its head tilted even further to the side, like a dog hearing a strange sound. That's when it made its own sound. A low, rumbling noise that seemed to come from deep in its chest. Not quite a growl, not quite a purr, but something that made every hair on my body stand on end. "Okay," Mark said, still speaking in that barely audible whisper. "We're going to back away slowly. Keep your flashlight on it, but don't make any sudden movements." We started to retreat, step by careful step. The creature watched us go, that unnatural head tilt never changing. For a moment, I thought we might actually make it out of there without incident. Then Mark's foot caught on a fallen branch, and he stumbled. The sound of his curse and the crash of him hitting the ground seemed to echo through the forest like a gunshot. The creature's head snapped upright, and for the first time I got a clear look at its face. It had no face. Where features should have been, there was just smooth, pale skin stretched over what looked like a skull. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just that horrible, featureless expanse of white flesh. And then it opened its mouth. The mouth appeared like a gash splitting across that blank face, revealing rows of teeth that were too sharp, too numerous, arranged in patterns that defied anatomy. The sound that came out was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Part scream, part roar, part something that I don't have words for. Mark scrambled to his feet, all thoughts of moving slowly forgotten. "Run!" he shouted. We ran. Behind us, I could hear the creature crashing through the underbrush, and it was gaining on us fast. Whatever it was, it moved through the forest like it belonged there, like every tree and rock and fallen log was just part of an obstacle course it knew by heart. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. The thing was closer than I'd expected, close enough that I could see the way its two long limbs moved with a fluid grace that was completely at odds with its appearance. It wasn't running so much as flowing through the forest, covering ground with an efficiency that no human could match. "The truck!" Mark gasped, pointing ahead to where we'd parked at the trailhead. We burst out of the forest and into the parking area, and for a moment I thought we'd made it. The truck was right there, maybe 50 yards away. Mark was already pulling out his keys, running toward the driver's side. But the creature didn't follow us out of the trees. We reached the truck and threw ourselves inside, slamming the doors and locking them as if sheet metal and glass could keep out whatever we'd just encountered. Mark started the engine with shaking hands, and we sat there for a moment, breathing hard and staring at the tree line. "Did you see its face?" I asked, when I could finally speak. "It didn't have a face," Mark replied. "That's the point." We waited another minute, but nothing emerged from the forest. The creature seemed content to stay in its domain, having driven us out of its territory. "We need to call this in," Mark said, reaching for his radio. "And tell them what? That we found 2 murder victims and got chased out by some kind of monster?" Mark looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. Pure, undiluted fear. "We tell them the truth," he said, "and hope they believe us." But as we drove back toward town, I couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was something nobody would want to believe. The thing we'd encountered in the forest wasn't supposed to exist, wasn't part of the natural world that park rangers were trained to deal with. And somehow, I knew we were going to see it again. The next 12 hours passed in a blur of police interviews, incident reports, and increasingly uncomfortable questions about what exactly Mark and I had encountered in the forest. State Trooper Detective Linda Vasquez was handling the case, and she had the kind of sharp, analytical mind that didn't leave much room for unexplained phenomena. "Let me get this straight," she said, reviewing her notes in the cramped conference room at the park headquarters. "You found 2 bodies that appear to have been killed by an unknown animal, and then you were chased away by something you can't identify." "That's correct," Mark replied. He'd aged 10 years overnight, his face gray with exhaustion and stress. "And this unknown animal, you're telling me it stood upright? Like a person?" "Not like a person," I said. "The proportions were all wrong. Too tall, limbs too long. And the face—" I trailed off, not sure how to explain what we'd seen without sounding completely insane. Detective Vasquez looked at us both with the kind of expression that suggested she thought we were either lying or having some kind of shared psychotic break. I couldn't blame her. In her shoes, I probably would have thought the same thing. "Look," she said finally, "I've been a cop for 15 years. I've seen what bears can do to people, what mountain lions can do. I've seen the aftermath of dog attacks, domestic disputes gone wrong, even a few genuine accidents that looked like something out of a horror movie. But what you're describing?" She shook her head. "It doesn't exist." "Then explain the bodies," Mark said quietly. That was the problem, of course. The medical examiner had taken one look at Tyler and Emma Buchanan and immediately called for backup. The wounds were unlike anything in his experience. Too systematic to be from a wild animal, too savage to be from a human attacker. The working theory was that we were dealing with some kind of exotic animal, possibly an escaped exotic pet or something released illegally into the wild. But that theory had problems too. The tracks we'd found didn't match anything in the databases. The behavior described by witnesses, if you could call Mark and me witnesses, didn't fit any known predator patterns. And then there was the question of how something that large could have survived in the Adirondack ecosystem without being spotted before now. "We're organizing a search team," Detective Vasquez told us. "State police, Park Service, a few local hunters who know the area. We're going to find this thing, whatever it is, and put an end to it before anyone else gets hurt." "I want to be part of the search," I said. The detective studied me carefully. "You sure about that? After what you've been through?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure about anything anymore. The rational part of my mind was screaming at me to stay as far away from those woods as possible, but another part, the part that had become a park ranger because I loved the wilderness, couldn't stand the thought of that thing being out there, hunting. "All right," she said, "but you're going in with a full team. Nobody goes into those woods alone." The search began at dawn the next day. We had 12 people total, 4 state troopers, 3 Park Service personnel including Mark and me, 3 local hunters who knew the terrain, and 2 state wildlife biologists who specialized in large predators. Everyone was armed, everyone had radios, and everyone had been briefed on what we might be facing. The problem was, nobody really knew what we might be facing. We started at the Buchanan campsite and worked outward in a grid pattern, staying in visual contact with each other at all times. The forest was eerily quiet, just like it had been the day before. No bird calls, no small animal sounds, just the crunch of our boots on the pine needles and the occasional crackle of radio static. It was Jim Morrison, one of the local hunters, who found the first new sign. Jim was a weathered man in his 60s who'd been hunting these woods since he was a teenager. If anyone could track an unknown predator, it was him. "Got something here," he called out, crouching next to a fallen log about a half-mile from the original crime scene. We gathered around as he pointed out marks in the soft earth. The same strange 4-toed tracks we'd found at the campsite. But these were fresher. Much fresher. "These are from last night," Jim said, studying the impressions. "Maybe even this morning." "So it's still in the area," Detective Vasquez said. "Not just in the area," Jim replied, following the trail with his eyes. "It's been moving around a lot. See how the tracks overlap? This thing's been pacing like it's agitated or hunting." The trail led us deeper into the forest, through terrain that became increasingly difficult to navigate. Fallen trees created natural barriers, and thick underbrush forced us to move in single file. The tracks were easier to follow now. Whatever we were pursuing had stopped trying to hide its presence. We'd been following the trail for about an hour when Dr. Sarah Chen, one of the wildlife biologists, stopped abruptly. "Listen," she said. We all froze, straining our ears. At first I heard nothing except the usual forest sounds, wind in the trees, the distant call of a crow. But then I caught it, a low rhythmic sound, almost like breathing, but deeper, more resonant. "What is that?" one of the troopers asked. "I don't know," Dr. Chen replied, "but it's big." The sound seemed to be coming from ahead of us, somewhere in the dense thicket of pines and maples that clogged the valley floor. Jim motioned for us to spread out, keeping the creature surrounded while staying within sight of each other. We crept forward, weapons ready, trying to make as little noise as possible. The breathing sound grew louder as we approached, and with it came that same organic stench Mark and I had noticed the night before. Rotting meat mixed with something else, something that reminded me of wet fur and musk. It was Mark who saw it first. "There," he whispered, pointing to a gap between 2 large pine trees. The creature was about 40 yards away, partially hidden in the shadows. It was lying down, curled up like a sleeping animal, but even at rest it was obviously massive. I could see the pale skin, the elongated limbs, the unnatural proportions that had made my skin crawl the night before. But there was something else, something that made my blood run cold. It wasn't alone. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light under the canopy, I could make out at least 2 other shapes nearby. They were smaller than the first creature, but clearly the same species. All 3 of them seemed to be resting, their breathing creating that rhythmic sound we'd been hearing. "Jesus," Detective Vasquez breathed. "How many of them are there?" Before anyone could answer, one of the smaller creatures raised its head and looked directly at us. Even from 40 yards away, I could see the moment it registered our presence. The head tilted in that unnatural way, and I knew it was trying to figure out what we were. "Nobody move," Jim whispered. "Maybe it won't." The creature let out a sound that cut through the forest like a chainsaw through silk. Not the mournful call we'd heard the night before, but something sharper, more urgent, an alarm call. All three creatures were on their feet instantly, moving with that fluid grace that defied their size. The largest one, the one Mark and I had encountered the night before, stood up to its full height, and I realized with sick certainty that we were looking at something that had no business existing in the natural world. It was at least 8 feet tall, with limbs that seemed too long for its torso and skin that was the color of old bone. Its head was elongated, skull-like, and when it opened its mouth to make that horrible sound again, I could see rows of teeth that belonged in a nightmare. "Fall back," Detective Vasquez ordered. "Everyone fall back now." But the creatures weren't going to let us retreat that easily. The largest one moved first, covering the distance between us with terrifying speed. It didn't run so much as flow through the forest, using trees and rocks as launching points to propel itself forward. Behind it, the 2 smaller creatures flanked out to either side, trying to surround us. "Open fire!" Detective Vasquez shouted. The forest erupted in gunfire. I drew my sidearm and started shooting, though I had no idea if bullets would even affect these things. Around me, the other searchers were doing the same, filling the air with the sharp crack of rifle fire and the deeper boom of shotguns. I saw at least 2 of my shots hit the largest creature center mass, but it barely seemed to notice. Dark liquid, not quite blood but something similar, splattered from the wounds, but the thing kept coming. Then it was among us. The creature slammed into Trooper Williams like a freight train, sending him flying into a tree trunk with a sickening crunch. Before anyone could react, it had pivoted and was reaching for Dr. Chen with those impossibly long arms. I put 3 more rounds into its torso, and this time it seemed to feel them. The thing stumbled slightly, that horrible head turning in my direction. For a split second we made eye contact, though I'm not sure it had eyes in any conventional sense, and I saw something there that chilled me to the bone: intelligence. This wasn't just some wild animal acting on instinct. It was thinking, planning, deciding what to do next. What it decided was to come after me. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush as fast as my legs could carry me. Behind me I could hear the creature pursuing, its breathing harsh and rapid in the thin mountain air. But there were other sounds too. Screams, more gunfire, the unmistakable sounds of a battle that we were losing. I made it about 100 yards before something slammed into my back, sending me tumbling down a steep slope covered in loose rocks and pine needles. I hit the bottom hard, my left shoulder taking most of the impact. Pain shot through my arm, but I managed to keep hold of my gun. The creature landed at the top of the slope with that unnatural grace, looking down at me like a cat studying a wounded mouse. This close, I could see details that my mind didn't want to process, the way its skin seemed to shift and move slightly, as if something was crawling underneath it. The way its limbs bent at joints that weren't quite in the right places. The way that horrible blank face somehow managed to convey emotion despite having no features. It was enjoying this. The thing started down the slope toward me, moving carefully now, taking its time. I raised my gun and fired, putting 2 round center mass. Dark liquid splattered, and the creature staggered slightly, but it kept coming. I fired again, aiming for what I hoped was its head. The bullet took off a piece of that pale skin, revealing something underneath that I really didn't want to see. The creature made a sound that might have been pain, or might have been anger, or might have been something else entirely. But it kept coming. I had 2 rounds left. At this range, I couldn't miss, but I was beginning to doubt whether conventional weapons could stop this thing. I was trying to decide whether to aim for the head again or try for something that might be a vital organ when I heard a new sound echoing through the forest. Sirens. Lots of them getting closer. The creature heard them too, its head snapped up, turning toward the sound with that unnatural flexibility. For a moment it seemed to be considering its options: finish me off or flee from the approaching reinforcements. It chose to flee. The thing turned and bounded up the slope with impossible speed, disappearing into the forest as if it had never been there at all. I lay at the bottom of the slope, bleeding from a dozen scrapes and bruises, listening to the sirens getting closer and wondering how many of my fellow searchers were still alive. As it turned out, we'd been lucky. Trooper Williams had a concussion and 3 broken ribs, but he'd live. Dr. Chen had claw marks across her back that would require stitches, but nothing life-threatening. The other Dr. Sarah Chen had twisted her ankle badly but was otherwise unharmed. We'd lost Jim Morrison. They found his body about 50 yards from where the main confrontation had taken place. Like Tyler and Emma Buchanan, he'd been torn apart with systematic precision. But there was something different about Jim's wounds, something that made Detective Vasquez look sick when she saw them. They were cauterized, burned closed, as if the creature had some way of sealing the wounds it inflicted, as if it wanted to keep its victims alive as long as possible. "What the hell are we dealing with?" Detective Vasquez asked me as the EMTs loaded Jim's body into the ambulance. I looked back at the forest, where something that shouldn't exist was still out there, still hunting. "I don't know," I said, "but I don't think bullets are going to stop it." That night, I couldn't go home. Detective Vasquez had told all the survivors to get some rest, maybe see a doctor about our various injuries, and report back in the morning for debriefing. But the thought of going back to my empty apartment in Lake George, of lying in bed staring at the ceiling while that thing was still out there, was more than I could handle. Instead, I drove to the remote ranger station at Pine Ridge, a small wooden cabin about 5 miles from where we'd encountered the creatures. It was officially closed for the season, but I had keys to all the Park Service buildings, and I needed somewhere to think, somewhere I could process what I'd seen without having to explain it to anyone else. The Pine Ridge station was basic, just one room with a desk, a radio, a small kitchen area, and a cot for rangers who had to stay overnight during emergencies. It was surrounded by dense forest on 3 sides, with a small parking area and access road on the 4th. Not exactly the kind of place you'd want to hole up if you were trying to avoid forest-dwelling monsters, but it was better than being alone in town. I parked my truck close to the front door and went inside, flicking on the lights and checking the radio. The batteries were low, but it was functional. I tried to raise Marlin at the main headquarters, but got nothing but static. Not unusual for this location, the mountains played hell with radio signals, especially at night. I made myself a cup of coffee from the supplies I found in the kitchen and sat down at the desk to try to make sense of what was happening. 3 people were dead, killed by something that shouldn't exist. We'd engaged it with trained law enforcement officers and military-grade weapons, and it had barely slowed down. And there were at least 3 of them, maybe more. I was still trying to process the implications when I heard the first sound. It was subtle at first, just a soft scratching noise that could have been a branch rubbing against the building in the wind. But there was no wind that night, and the sound had a rhythm to it, a deliberate quality that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I turned off the lights and moved to one of the small windows, peering out into the darkness. The security light in the parking area cast a pale circle of illumination, but beyond that, everything was black. I could make out the shapes of trees at the edge of the clearing, but nothing moved. The scratching came again, this time from the back of the building. I drew my sidearm, I'd reloaded after the afternoon's encounter, and moved to the rear window. The view was blocked by a storage shed about 20 feet away, but I could see the edge of the forest beyond it. Something was moving in the trees. It was just a shadow at first, barely visible against the darker background of the forest. But as I watched, it became more distinct, tall, pale, moving with that unnatural grace I'd come to recognize. It was testing the perimeter, staying just inside the tree line, watching the building. I backed away from the window and reached for the radio, trying to raise anyone who might be listening. "This is Ranger Norris at Pine Ridge Station," I whispered into the microphone. "I have eyes on one of the suspects. Request immediate backup." Static answered me. I tried again, adjusting the frequency. "Mayday, mayday, this is Sam Norris at Pine Ridge. I need immediate assistance." Nothing. Either the radio wasn't working, or no one was monitoring the emergency frequencies. Either way, I was on my own. The scratching sound moved to the front of the building, and I realized with growing terror that the creature was circling the cabin, testing for weaknesses. I'd been in the Park Service long enough to know that these buildings weren't designed to keep out determined predators. The windows were single-pane glass, the doors were solid wood but not reinforced, and the walls were just standard frame construction. If that thing wanted to get inside, it could. I turned off the desk lamp and moved through the cabin in darkness, checking the doors and windows. The front door had a deadbolt, which I engaged, and there was a back door that led to a small storage area. I pushed a filing cabinet in front of the back door and did the same with the desk at the front entrance. It wasn't much, but it might buy me a few seconds if the creature decided to make a move. The scratching stopped, and for a moment, the silence was even worse than the sound had been. I stood in the center of the cabin, gun drawn, trying to listen for any indication of where the thing had gone. Then I heard breathing. It was coming from right outside the front window, maybe 3 feet away from where I was standing. Deep, rhythmic breathing, like something large and patient waiting for the right moment to strike. I moved away from the window as quietly as possible, but the floorboards creaked under my weight. The breathing stopped instantly, and I knew the creature had heard me. For several long minutes, nothing happened. I stood in the darkness, heart hammering in my chest, waiting for the sound of breaking glass or splintering wood. But the creature seemed content to wait, to let the fear build. Then I heard a new sound, a soft tapping on the glass of the front window. Tap, tap, tap. It was almost gentle, like someone politely asking to be let in. But there was something about the rhythm that made my skin crawl. It was too regular, too patient, like a predator that knew it had all the time in the world. The tapping moved to the side window, then to the back. The creature was making its way around the building again, but this time it was announcing its presence, letting me know that it knew exactly where I was. I tried the radio again, but got nothing except static. The landline phone was dead too. Not unusual for this remote location, but frustrating as hell under the circumstances. The tapping stopped, and once again, the silence stretched out like a living thing. I found myself holding my breath, straining to hear any sound that might give away the creature's location. That's when I heard the footsteps on the roof. They were heavy, deliberate, moving from one end of the building to the other. The creature had climbed up onto the cabin, and now it was testing the structural integrity of the roof. I looked up at the ceiling, watching for any sign that the boards might give way under its weight. A small shower of dust fell from the rafters as the footsteps moved directly overhead. The creature was big. I'd seen that during our encounter in the forest, but I had no idea it was heavy enough to make the entire building shake. The footsteps stopped, directly above where I was standing. I could hear the creature settling into position, as if it was making itself comfortable. Then silence. I waited. Minutes passed. The creature didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was just there, waiting. I was still trying to figure out what it was planning when I heard a new sound, a soft, almost conversational noise that seemed to be coming from the creature's throat. It wasn't the horrible scream I'd heard in the forest or the mournful call that had echoed through the trees. This was different, quieter, almost like it was talking to itself, or to me. The sound continued for several minutes, rising and falling in pitch like some kind of alien language. I found myself listening despite my terror, trying to make sense of the patterns. Was it trying to communicate? Was it taunting me? Or was it just the sound a predator made when it was content, when it knew its prey was trapped? Then, as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The footsteps resumed, moving toward the back of the building. I heard a new sound, the screech of metal being bent or torn. The creature was doing something to the roof, but I couldn't tell what. A few minutes later, I found out. Water started dripping from the ceiling in the back corner of the cabin. Just a few drops at first, but then more, faster. The creature had torn a hole in the roof, and now the night air was coming in. But it wasn't just air. Along with the cool mountain breeze came that smell, the organic, rotting stench that seemed to follow the creatures everywhere. And with the smell came something else, the sound of breathing, much closer now, coming from directly above the hole in the roof. The creature was trying to get inside. I moved to the front of the cabin as far from the damaged roof as possible and tried to think of a plan. The radio was useless, the phone was dead, and my truck keys were in my pocket, but the truck was parked right outside the front door, where the creature would see me the moment I stepped outside. I was trapped, and the thing knew it. The hole in the roof was getting bigger. I could hear the creature working at it, tearing away boards and roofing material with what sounded like its bare hands, or claws, or whatever passed for appendages on that nightmare anatomy. More debris fell from the ceiling, and the smell got stronger. I realized with sick certainty that the creature wasn't just trying to get inside. It was taking its time, savoring the fear, drawing out the hunt for its own amusement. That's when I remembered the flare gun. Every ranger carried one, along with emergency flares for signaling aircraft or other rescue teams. Mine was clipped to my belt, and I'd forgotten about it in the chaos of the afternoon's encounter. But now, looking up at the growing hole in the roof, I realized it might be my only chance. Flares burned at extremely high temperatures, hot enough to start fires, hot enough to cause severe burns to anything they hit. If I could get a clear shot when the creature came through the roof, the hole was almost big enough now. I could see stars through the gap, and occasionally a shadow would pass across them as the creature moved around the opening. It was getting ready to drop down into the cabin. I positioned myself against the far wall, flare gun drawn and ready. My heart was beating so fast I thought it might explode, but my hands were steady. 3 years of ranger training had taught me to stay calm in emergencies, and if this didn't qualify as an emergency, nothing did. A piece of the ceiling crashed down onto the floor, followed by more debris. The hole was definitely big enough now for something to come through. I raised the flare gun, aiming at the opening, and waited. The breathing sounds from above got louder, closer. I could see something pale moving in the darkness beyond the hole, part of an arm maybe, or a leg. The creature was positioning itself to drop down. Then, suddenly, it pulled back. I heard rapid movement on the roof, footsteps heading toward the edge of the building. Had it changed its mind? Had it sensed the flare gun somehow? A moment later, I got my answer. The front window exploded inward in a shower of glass and wood frame. The creature had jumped down from the roof and launched itself through the window like a missile, landing in the center of the cabin in a crouch. This close, in the confined space of the cabin, it was even more terrifying than it had been in the forest. It filled the room with its presence, all pale skin and impossible angles, and that horrible eyeless face turned in my direction. I fired the flare gun. The flare hit the creature's center mass and exploded in a burst of red light and burning chemicals. The thing let out a scream that made my teeth ache and staggered backward, clawing at the flare that was now burning into its torso. But it didn't go down. Instead, it turned that nightmare face toward me, and despite the lack of visible features, I could sense its rage. The flare was still burning, stuck to its chest like napalm, but it wasn't enough to stop it. The creature took a step toward me, then another. I grabbed my pistol and emptied the clip into it, putting all 15 rounds center mass. Dark liquid sprayed from the wounds, and the creature stumbled, but it kept coming. I threw myself toward the back door, shoving aside the filing cabinet I'd used to barricade it. My shoulder screamed in protest. I'd aggravated the injury from my fall in the forest, but adrenaline carried me through. I burst out of the cabin and ran for the tree line, not caring about the darkness or the rough terrain. Behind me, I could hear the creature crashing through the cabin, destroying everything in its path as it pursued me. I made it about 50 yards into the forest before I realized I'd made a terrible mistake. I was running blind in unfamiliar terrain with no light and no clear destination. And I was running into the creature's territory, where it had every advantage. I stopped, pressing my back against a large pine tree, and tried to listen for sounds of pursuit. The forest was quiet except for my own ragged breathing and the sound of my heart hammering in my chest. Then I heard it, that soft, conversational sound the creature had made while it was on the roof. It was somewhere behind me, maybe 20 or 30 yards away, and it seemed to be moving parallel to my position rather than directly toward me. It was hurting me. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The creature wasn't just chasing me randomly, it was driving me in a specific direction, toward some predetermined destination. Maybe toward the other creatures I'd seen in the forest. Maybe toward some kind of lair or feeding ground. I tried to change direction, moving perpendicular to what I thought was the creature's position. But every time I did, I heard that sound again, closer now, cutting off my escape routes. I was being hunted by something that was smarter than me, stronger than me, and perfectly adapted to this environment. And I was running out of options. That's when I saw the light. It was just a flicker at first, barely visible through the trees. But as I got closer, I realized it was artificial, electric light coming from what looked like another building, a way station maybe, or a hunter's cabin. I changed course, heading toward the light, hoping against hope that it represented safety. Behind me, the creature's vocalizations became more agitated, as if it realized its prey was about to escape. I burst out of the forest and into a small clearing where a hunting cabin sat next to a narrow dirt road. Lights were on inside, and I could see a pickup truck parked next to the building. Someone was home. I ran toward the cabin, shouting for help, when the front door opened and a man stepped out. He was middle-aged, wearing hunting clothes, and he had a rifle in his hands. "What the hell?" he started to say, then stopped as he saw me. "There's something in the forest," I gasped, stumbling toward him. "Something dangerous. We need to call for help." The man looked past me toward the tree line, and his expression changed. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "What is that thing?" I turned to follow his gaze and saw the creature standing at the edge of the clearing, just inside the forest. It was completely motionless, watching us with that terrible, eyeless face. The flare was still burning on its chest, casting flickering shadows across its pale skin. "Get inside," the man said, raising his rifle. "Now." We backed toward the cabin, keeping our eyes on the creature. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just watched us retreat, as if it was calculating its next move. We made it inside the cabin, and the man, who introduced himself as Bill Hartman, helped me barricade the door. He had a landline phone, and within minutes we'd contacted the state police and requested immediate backup. "How long until they get here?" I asked. Bill looked out the window toward the forest. The creature was gone, but we both knew it was still out there. 20 minutes, he said. Maybe 30. I looked at my watch. It was just past midnight. We had to hold out until help arrived, and I had no idea if that was possible. Outside, something began to circle the cabin, and I realized the nightmare was just beginning. The siege lasted until dawn. For the next 5 hours, Bill and I huddled in that hunting cabin while the creature, and at least 2 others that had joined it, systematically tested every possible way to get inside. They tried the windows, the doors, even the chimney. They climbed onto the roof and tried to tear it apart the same way the first one had done at the ranger station. When that didn't work, they tried psychological warfare. The sounds they made still haunt me. Sometimes it was that conversational murmuring, as if they were discussing strategy. Sometimes it was mimicry, perfect imitations of human voices calling for help, pleading to be let inside. Once, I swear I heard one of them say my name in a voice that sounded exactly like my sister's, even though she lived 3,000 miles away in Oregon. "Don't listen to it," Bill warned me when I started to move toward the window. "Whatever you do, don't listen." Bill had encountered the creatures before, it turned out. Not face to face like Mark and I had, but he'd found evidence of their presence over the past few months. Tracks that didn't match any known animal. Prey animals that had been killed and partially eaten, but left in ways that suggested ritual rather than simple predation. Strange sounds echoing through the forest at night. "I thought I was going crazy," he told me as we waited for dawn. "Started wondering if I'd been in the woods too long, seeing things that weren't there." But they were there. And now they were outside his cabin trying to get in. The first police units arrived around 3 a.m., but the creatures had vanished back into the forest long before the officers could get into position. By the time Detective Vasquez showed up with a full tactical team, there was nothing to see but disturbed earth around the cabin and a few more of those impossible footprints. "Are you hurt?" she asked me as I stumbled out of the cabin. I was scraped up from my run through the forest, my shoulder was throbbing from where I'd hit the slope, and I hadn't slept in 36 hours. But I was alive, which was more than I'd expected a few hours earlier. "I'm okay," I said. "But we need to do something about these things. They're not going away." Detective Vasquez nodded grimly. "We've got the National Guard on standby, and there's a team from the CDC flying in this afternoon. Whatever these things are, we're going to figure out how to stop them." But even as she said it, I could see the doubt in her eyes. How do you fight something that bullets barely slow down? How do you track something that can disappear into the forest like smoke? How do you kill something that might not even be alive in any conventional sense? The CDC team arrived that afternoon, led by Dr. Marcus Webb, a specialist in exotic diseases and unknown pathogens. He took tissue samples from the dark liquid we'd found at various encounter sites, interviewed all the survivors, and spent hours studying the footprint casts that had been made. His conclusion was both fascinating and terrifying. Based on the tissue analysis, he told us in a briefing that evening, We're dealing with something that's partially organic and partially something else. The cellular structure is unlike anything in our databases. It's as if someone took human DNA and mixed it with something that shouldn't exist. Are you saying these things are artificial? Detective Vasquez asked. I'm saying they're not entirely natural, Dr. Webb replied carefully. Whether they're the result of genetic experimentation, environmental contamination, or something else entirely, I can't determine from the samples we have. What we did determine was that the creatures were incredibly resilient. The tissue samples continued to show signs of activity even after being removed from the source, and when Dr. Webb tried to destroy a sample with extreme heat, it seemed to regenerate itself. We're going to need a different approach, he said. That different approach came in the form of fire. The decision to burn them out was controversial, but after another night of attacks, this time targeting a family camping near Lake George, the authorities decided they had no choice. A controlled burn was the only way to flush the creatures out of the forest and into areas where they could be contained and studied. I volunteered to be part of the operation. After everything I'd been through, I needed to see this finished. I needed to know that these things wouldn't be able to hurt anyone else. The burn was scheduled for the following morning. Firefighting teams would create fire breaks around a large section of forest where the creatures had been most active, then systematically burn inward toward the center. The theory was that the creatures would be forced to flee to the one remaining exit, where heavily armed teams would be waiting. It was a good plan. It should have worked. But we underestimated just how intelligent these things were. The burn started at dawn, with teams working from multiple directions to create a contracting circle of fire. I was with the eastern team, watching the flames spread through the underbrush and up into the lower branches of the pine trees. The fire was controlled, professional, designed to clear undergrowth without destroying the entire forest. For the first few hours, everything went according to plan. The creatures seemed to be staying ahead of the flames, moving toward the center of the burn area as expected. We had thermal imaging drones tracking their movement, and the plan seemed to be working. Then, around noon, the creatures changed tactics. Instead of continuing to flee from the fire, they started moving toward it. The thermal imaging showed them approaching the fire breaks from multiple directions, as if they were coordinating an attack on the firefighting teams. All units be advised, came the radio call from the command post. Subjects are changing direction. They're coming toward your positions. I was with a team of 6 firefighters and 3 state troopers, working a fire break about a quarter mile from the main blaze. We'd been watching for creatures fleeing the fire, not attacking from it. The first one came out of the smoke like something from hell itself. It was one of the larger ones, covered in soot and moving with that terrifying fluid grace despite the fact that parts of its pale skin were obviously burned. It emerged from the flames and launched itself at the nearest firefighter before any of us could react. The firefighter, a man named Rodriguez who'd been doing this job for 15 years, went down screaming. The creature landed on top of him and began tearing at his protective gear with those impossible claws. The rest of us opened fire, but the creature seemed to be energized by the flames rather than weakened by them. It turned from Rodriguez's body and came toward us, moving faster than anything that size should have been able to move. That's when I realized the truth about these creatures. They weren't just resistant to fire, they were powered by it. The flames that should have driven them away or killed them were instead making them stronger, faster, more aggressive. "Fall back," I shouted, but it was too late. 2 more creatures emerged from the burning forest, and suddenly we were surrounded. The tactical situation had gone from a controlled burn to a fighting retreat in a matter of seconds. I found myself back to back with Trooper Martinez, firing at anything that moved while trying to reach the vehicles we'd parked at the road. Around us, the other members of our team were fighting for their lives against creatures that seemed to grow more powerful with each passing minute. "We need to get out of here," Martinez yelled over the sound of gunfire and screaming. I couldn't have agreed more. We started moving toward the road, laying down covering fire, but the creatures were hurting us again. Every time we tried to break toward the vehicles, one of them would appear to cut us off. They were playing with us. Just like they had with me at the ranger station, they were drawing out the hunt for their own amusement. That's when the explosion happened. I never found out exactly what caused it, whether it was a fuel tank from one of the firefighting vehicles, or a propane canister, or something else entirely. But the blast was enormous, sending a column of fire and smoke hundreds of feet into the air. The creature's reaction was immediate and unexpected. Instead of being driven away by the explosion, they seemed drawn to it. All three of them turned toward the fireball and began moving in that direction, their attention completely diverted from us. Martinez and I didn't waste the opportunity. We ran for the road, covered the distance to our vehicle in record time, and got the hell out of there. The controlled burn was called off within an hour. Too many casualties, too many variables, too much evidence that our enemy was smarter and more adaptable than we'd given it credit for. But something else happened that day. Something that changed everything. Dr. Webb, monitoring the situation from the command post, noticed something in the thermal imaging data. The creature's body temperatures had spiked dramatically during the fire, reaching levels that should have been fatal to any living organism. But instead of dying, they had seemed to feed off the heat, growing stronger and more active. "I think I know what they are," he told Detective Vasquez and me that evening. Or at least, what they might have been. He pulled up files on his laptop, showing us research from the 1950s and 60s, classified government experiments that had been declassified decades later. Project Wendigo, he said, a joint military scientific program designed to create enhanced soldiers who could survive in extreme environments. The project was officially terminated in 1963 after a series of accidents, but the research was never fully destroyed. "Are you saying these things are escaped government experiments?" Detective Vasquez asked. "I'm saying they might be the descendants of escaped experiments," Dr. Webb replied, "or the result of someone attempting to recreate the original research." The implications were staggering. If these creatures were the result of human experimentation, then there might be records of how they were created, and if they were created, there might be a way to destroy them. But that was a problem for another day. For now, we had more immediate concerns. The creatures were still out there, still hunting, and the fire had only made them stronger. As I drove home that night, exhausted and covered in soot, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were fighting a war we didn't understand against an enemy we couldn't defeat. The creatures had outsmarted us at every turn, adapted to every strategy we'd tried, and somewhere in the burned forest, they were waiting for us to try again. I never did find out the full truth about what those creatures were or where they came from. The investigation was taken over by federal authorities a few days later, and people like me, local rangers and small-town cops, were told to stay out of it for our own safety. But I kept working in the Adirondacks for another 2 years, and I never stopped listening for that sound in the forest. The mournful call that meant something impossible was watching from the shadows. I heard it a few more times, always distant, always just on the edge of perception. But I never saw the creatures again. Maybe the federal authorities found a way to deal with them. Maybe they moved on to other hunting grounds. Or maybe they just learned to be more careful about being seen. I left the Park Service in 2007 and moved to Arizona, where the desert doesn't have enough trees to hide things that shouldn't exist. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is just right, I still think I can hear that sound. A call from something that was once human, or almost human, echoing across the darkness. And I wonder if Tyler and Emma Buchanan, Jim Morrison and Rodriguez the firefighter were the only ones who paid the price for humanity's hubris, or if somewhere, in forests across the country, other creatures are waiting in the shadows, patient and intelligent and hungry. The official report listed the incidents as animal attacks by an unknown predator. The case was closed, the files were sealed, and life in the Adirondacks went back to normal. Tourists still come to camp and hike and enjoy the wilderness. Rangers still patrol the trails and help lost hikers. But we know the truth, some of us anyway. We know that the forest holds secrets darker than most people can imagine. And we know that sometimes, when you go deep enough into the wild places, you might find things that were never meant to exist. I still smell that campsite when I close my eyes. I still see those twisted limbs and that pale, eyeless face watching from the tree line. And I still wake up sometimes, in my apartment in Phoenix, thinking I can hear something breathing just outside my window. The park went on as usual, with new visitors and smiling photos in the brochures. But at night, alone in my apartment, I remember those creatures, and I know something impossible walked those woods, something that might still be walking them today. I managed to survive those few days in 2005, but I'm not sure I'll ever really escape them. The memory keeps haunting me, and sometimes I wonder if that's not exactly what those things wanted. For the survivors to carry the fear forward, to spread the story, to keep the legend alive. because that's what they were in the end. Modern legends, born from humanity's darkest impulses and set loose in the world to hunt and kill and watch from the shadows. And legends, as any park ranger will tell you, have a way of persisting long after the truth has been forgotten. The metallic taste of fear coated my tongue the moment I understood what we were truly hunting in those woods. Blood had already begun to seep across the pine needles, and I had no idea I'd soon come face to face with something so cunning and vicious, nor that I'd be forced to reveal everything I've kept hidden for years. Now I'm ready to share the truth, no matter how unbelievable it might sound. If you stay with me, I'll show you a side of the wild few dare to imagine. But brace yourself, because it's never gentle. My name is Marcus Bennett, and this nightmare began back in 2012 in the Cascade National Forest in Washington State. I'd been working search and rescue for nearly 8 years, but I always felt that distinct adrenaline surge every time a call came in. That gray October morning, dispatch crackled through with news about 2 missing hikers who had set out on a remote backcountry trail and failed to return to their planned pickup point. I climbed into the department's truck with my partner, Detective Ray Sullivan. Ray was the kind of guy who could find humor in a funeral. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow and a repertoire of terrible dad jokes that somehow managed to cut through the tension on our worst days. We'd worked together for 3 years, and his steady presence had pulled me through more than one difficult recovery. The Forest Service had been dealing with an unusual number of strange disappearances in the area, echoing patterns that researchers like David Paulides had documented across the country. But that morning, we assumed this would be routine. Maybe some city folks who'd wandered off trail or gotten caught in the early snow that had dusted the higher elevations overnight. We loaded our gear: first aid kits, climbing rope, emergency beacons, flares, and enough water for a 2-day search if necessary. Ray tossed in a thermos of coffee and a bag of his wife's homemade cookies, grinning as he caught my raised eyebrow. "What? A man's got to eat even when he's saving lives." The trailhead sat beneath towering Douglas firs, their trunks disappearing into a gray mist that clung to the canopy like cobwebs. The air carried that sharp, clean scent of approaching winter, pine resin mixed with the earthy smell of decomposing leaves. An old ranger named Tom Bradley met us by his weathered pickup truck, his face grim beneath a battered baseball cap. Tom had been patrolling these mountains for over 20 years. He was the sort of ranger who knew every hidden ravine, every animal trail, every place where a person might take shelter or meet trouble. His weathered hands gestured toward a hand-drawn map as he briefed us on the missing hikers. "Name's Jessica Chen and Michael Torres," Tom said, his voice gravelly from years of calling across valleys. "Young couple from Seattle, planned a 3-day backpacking trip along the North Ridge Trail, supposed to loop back to Timber Creek Campground. Their buddy was going to pick them up yesterday evening, never showed." Tom's expression darkened as he pointed to several red X's marked on his map. "Here's the thing that's got me worried. Nobody's seen hide nor hair of them anywhere along the main routes. Not a single other hiker, not the weekend campers at Maple Falls, nobody at the ranger stations. It's like they vanished the minute they left the parking lot." Ray whistled low. "Maybe they decided to go off script, take some unmarked trail." "Maybe," Tom said, but he didn't sound convinced. "Or maybe they ran into something they couldn't handle. Weather's been weird up there. Fog rolling in at strange times, temperature drops that don't match the forecast. And—" He paused, seeming to debate whether to continue. "And what?" I prompted. "Other hikers have been reporting some odd things, sounds that don't belong, tracks that don't match any known wildlife. Hell, last week a group of climbers swore they saw someone or something moving through the trees way up on the ridgeline, but when they got there with binoculars, nothing." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the October air. Ray clapped Tom on the shoulder. "Well, we'll keep our eyes open for Bigfoot. Come on, Marcus. Let's go find these kids before they freeze their asses off." We started up the steep trail, our boots crunching through a thin layer of frost-covered leaves. The forest felt unusually quiet. No birdsong, no rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. Just the soft whisper of wind through the branches and our own breathing, visible in small puffs of vapor. For the first hour, we maintained radio contact with dispatch, calling in our position every 15 minutes. We checked every obvious campsite, every stream crossing, every place someone might stop to rest or take photos. We found absolutely nothing. "This is weird," Ray muttered as we paused at a trail junction. "Even if they went off the beaten path, we should see some sign. Footprints in the mud, broken branches, something." I knelt beside a small creek, studying the soft earth along its banks. The only tracks I could make out belonged to deer and what looked like a family of raccoons. But there was something else, a strange depression in the mud, roughly circular and about the size of a dinner plate, but deep enough that it had filled with dark water. "Ray, come look at this." He crouched beside me, frowning at the odd marking. "What do you think made that?" "I have no idea. It's too big for any animal foot I know, but too round. And look how deep it is. Whatever left this was heavy." Ray stood and scanned the surrounding forest, his hand unconsciously drifting to the radio clipped to his shoulder. "Maybe we should call Tom, get his take on this." Before I could respond, we heard it, a sound that made both of us freeze. It started as a low moan, almost like wind through a cave, but there was something distinctly unnatural about it. It rose in pitch, became more shrill, then cut off abruptly. "What the hell was that?" Ray whispered. The sound had come from somewhere ahead of us, deeper into the forest where the trees grew so thick that the canopy blocked out most of the gray daylight. I felt my heart rate spike as every instinct screamed at me to turn around and head back to the truck. Instead, I shouldered my pack and started forward. Could be one of the missing hikers, someone hurt, calling for help. Ray fell into step behind me, but I could hear the skepticism in his voice. "That didn't sound human, Marcus." "Then we need to find out what it was." We pushed deeper into the forest, following what might have been a game trail or might have been our imagination. The trees seemed to press closer with each step, their branches creating a tunnel of green-black shadows that muffled our footsteps and made every sound seem both too loud and too distant. That's when we found the first piece of evidence that Jessica and Michael had actually made it this far into the wilderness. Snagged on a low branch about chest-high was a strip of bright blue fabric, the kind used in high-end hiking gear. Ray carefully worked it free and held it up to catch what little light filtered through the canopy. "Looks fresh," he said. "No weathering, no fading. This was left recently." I examined the branch where the fabric had been caught. The bark was scraped and gouged, as if someone had been pulled or dragged past it with considerable force. Below the branch, several smaller twigs were snapped off, and I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Dark stains spattered the leaves and moss at the base of the tree. Not enough to indicate a serious injury, but definitely blood. "Ray." He looked where I was pointing and swore under his breath. We both knew what this meant. Someone had been hurt here, and recently. Whether it was Jessica or Michael, we had no way of knowing, but it confirmed our worst fears about this search. I pulled out my radio and tried to raise Tom, but got nothing but static. The thick canopy and the strange electromagnetic properties of the Cascade Mountains often interfered with communications, but the timing felt ominous. "We should head back," Ray said quietly. "Get more people, better equipment, dogs maybe." I wanted to agree with him, but something held me back. If one of the missing hikers was injured and alone out here, every hour we delayed could mean the difference between life and death. The thought of Jessica or Michael lying somewhere in these dark woods, bleeding and afraid, overrode my growing sense of unease. "Let's go a little further," I said, "just to see if we can pick up their trail." Ray didn't look happy about it, but he nodded. We both knew the protocol. Never abandon a search when there's evidence that victims might still be alive. We followed what seemed to be a path through the undergrowth, marked by more broken branches and occasional scuff marks in the dirt. The blood trail had stopped, which could mean the injured person had bandaged their wound or other possibilities I didn't want to consider. The forest grew stranger as we ventured deeper. Trees that should have been familiar looked twisted and malformed. Moss hung from branches in ways that seemed almost deliberate, like green curtains designed to hide whatever lay beyond. Even the air felt different, thicker, with an underlying scent that reminded me of something rotting. After another 30 minutes of slow progress, we emerged into a small clearing. In the center stood a massive Douglas fir that must have been centuries old, its trunk easily 12 feet in diameter. And scattered around its base was camping gear. A blue two-person tent, collapsed and partially shredded. A portable camp stove, overturned in the dirt. Sleeping bags ripped open, their synthetic fillings scattered like snow across the forest floor. And everywhere signs of a violent struggle. Gouged earth, broken tree limbs, more dark stains that could only be blood. Jesus Christ, Ray breathed. I approached the destroyed campsite carefully, scanning for any sign of what had happened here. This was definitely where Jessica and Michael had planned to spend at least one night. I found a waterlogged driver's license half buried in leaves. Michael Torres, 26, Seattle, Washington. But where were the bodies? Ray was examining the tent, his face pale. Marcus, look at this. The tears in the nylon weren't random. They formed a pattern. Long, parallel slashes that looked almost like claw marks, but too large and too deliberate for any animal I knew. Whatever had destroyed this tent had known exactly what it was doing. We need to get out of here, Ray said, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. Right now. I was about to agree when we heard the sound again, that unnatural moan rising from somewhere in the trees around us. But this time, it was answered by another call, and then another, until the forest echoed with a chorus of inhuman voices. And they were getting closer. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees in an instant. Our breath came in sharp puffs as we stood frozen in the destroyed campsite, listening to those impossible calls echoing through the forest around us. The sounds moved, circling us, testing us, hurting us. Move, I whispered, grabbing Ray's arm, slowly, back the way we came. We began to retreat from the clearing, stepping carefully over fallen branches and trying not to make any sound that might attract whatever was producing those calls. But the forest had become a maze of shadows and twisted shapes, and I soon realized we were no longer following the same path that had brought us here. Ray caught my arm and leaned close to my ear. We're lost. He was right. The trees all looked the same now, massive dark pillars stretching up into a canopy so thick it blocked out the sky. Worse, the calls had stopped, leaving us in a silence so complete it felt oppressive. We tried the radio again. Nothing but static, though I swore I could hear something else buried in the white noise, a faint scratching sound, like fingernails on wood. There, Ray whispered, pointing to a gap between two enormous firs. I think I see light. We pushed through the gap and found ourselves on what might have been another trail, though it was narrower than anything maintained by the Park Service. The path wound downhill through increasingly dense undergrowth, but Ray was right. There was definitely more light ahead, suggesting a larger clearing or maybe the edge of the forest. We hadn't gone more than 50 yards when we found the first body. Jessica Chen lay in a hollow beside the trail, her body contorted in an impossible position. Her hiking clothes were shredded, and her face was a mask of pure terror, eyes and mouth wide open as if she'd died screaming. But what made my stomach lurch was the condition of her limbs. Her arms and legs were bent at angles that defied human anatomy, twisted like a doll that had been pulled apart and reassembled by a sadistic child. There was no blood. Whatever had done this to her had been precise, surgical almost. Ray stumbled backward, his face green. What the fuck could do that to a person? I forced myself to examine the body more closely, fighting down nausea. No visible wounds, no signs of animal attack, just those impossible contortions. And her eyes, those terrified eyes, seemed to be staring at something behind us. I spun around, expecting to see some monster looming over us, but found only empty forest. Still, the feeling of being watched was so intense it made my skin crawl. We have to find Michael, I said, though my voice sounded strange and hollow in my own ears. Fuck Michael, Ray snapped. We have to get out of here before whatever did this comes back. I understood his fear. Christ, I felt it too, but I couldn't abandon the search. Not yet. Just a little further. If we don't find him in the next 10 minutes, we'll head back. Ray looked like he wanted to argue, but finally nodded. We continued down the narrow trail, both of us jumping at every shadow, every whisper of wind through the branches. We found Michael Torres another 100 yards down the path, or what was left of him. Unlike Jessica, Michael had been savaged. His body was scattered across the trail in pieces that I won't describe in detail, but the wounds weren't consistent with any animal attack I'd ever seen. The tears in his flesh were too clean, too deliberate, and arranged in patterns that suggested intelligence, a calculating malevolence that went far beyond simple predation. But the worst part was his head. It sat upright against a tree trunk 15 feet from the rest of his remains, and his eyes were moving, following us as we approached, blinking occasionally, lips moving as if trying to speak, though no sound emerged. Ray made a choking sound and stumbled into the bushes where I could hear him violently sick. I stood transfixed by Michael's impossible living gaze, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. The lips moved more frantically, and I found myself leaning closer, trying to read what he was attempting to say. The word formed silently over and over. Run, run, run. That's when I saw it. Something moved in the shadows between the trees behind Michael's head, a pale, elongated shape that seemed to flow rather than walk. It was watching us with eyes that reflected the dim light like an animal's, but there was nothing animal about the intelligence I saw there. It reminded me of the stories I'd heard from other search and rescue officers, tales of humanoid figures with unnaturally long limbs and faces that seemed almost human but wrong in fundamental ways. This thing was tall, maybe 7 feet, with arms that hung past its knees and skin that looked like wet leather stretched over 2 prominent bones. Its face was the worst part. Almost human, but the proportions were all wrong. Eyes too large, mouth too wide, stretching from ear to ear in a perpetual grin that showed far too many teeth, and that grin was fixed on us with predatory focus. Ray had recovered enough to rejoin me, but when he saw the thing lurking in the shadows, he went completely still. We both understood instinctively that any sudden movement would trigger an attack. The creature tilted its head with bird-like curiosity, studying us the way a scientist might examine lab specimens. When it moved, it did so with fluid grace that defied its apparent size, flowing between the trees like smoke, never taking its eyes off us. I reached slowly for the pistol on my belt, but the thing's grin widened as if it found my weapon amusing. It raised one impossibly long arm and pointed at us, and I heard that low moan again, not from its mouth but seeming to emanate from the forest itself. The call was answered immediately from multiple directions. They were all around us. "Marcus," Ray whispered, his voice tight with panic. "We need to run, now." But I couldn't move. The creature's eyes had locked onto mine, and I felt something probing at the edges of my mind. Cold, alien thoughts trying to burrow into my consciousness. Images flashed through my head. Jessica and Michael's final moments, the terror and agony as they realized what was happening to them. And something else, a sense of vast hunger, ancient and patient, that had been waiting in these woods for far longer than humans had walked the earth. The mental intrusion shattered when Ray grabbed my arm and yanked me backward. "Move your ass!" We ran. Behind us, the forest erupted in those inhuman calls, echoing from every direction as the things gave chase. I could hear them crashing through the undergrowth, moving with impossible speed through terrain that should have slowed them down. Ray was faster than me, his longer legs eating up ground as we fled down the narrow trail. But I could tell we weren't going to outrun them, not in their own territory, not when they knew every tree and stone. "This way," Ray shouted, veering off the trail toward what looked like denser forest. I followed without question, branches whipping at my face and tearing at my clothes. We burst through a screen of hanging moss and found ourselves on the edge of a steep ravine. Far below, I could see the silver glint of running water. Behind us, the calls were getting closer. "Can you make that jump?" Ray asked, pointing to a fallen log that bridged the ravine about 20 feet to our left. I looked at the rotting trunk, easily 40 feet long and slick with moss, spanning a drop that would definitely kill us if we fell. "Do we have a choice?" The first creature emerged from the forest behind us as we ran toward the log. In full daylight, it was even more horrible than I'd imagined. Its skin was mottled and pale, hanging loose in places like an ill-fitting costume. Its limbs moved in ways that suggested too many joints, and when it opened its mouth to emit another of those hunting calls, I saw rows of needle-sharp teeth. Ray reached the log first and started across without hesitation, arms outstretched for balance. The ancient wood creaked ominously under his weight, but held. I was 3 steps behind him when more creatures emerged from the forest, at least 5 of them, all variations on the same nightmarish theme. Some were taller, some broader, but all shared that awful grinning mouth and those hungry, intelligent eyes. The lead creature reached the edge of the ravine as I stepped onto the log. It didn't attempt to follow. Instead, it crouched at the lip of the drop and watched us with what I can only describe as amusement. As if our escape was temporary, a brief intermission in a game it was certain to win. Halfway across the log, I made the mistake of looking down. The ravine was deeper than I'd thought, easily 100-foot drop to jagged rocks and white water. The log swayed under my weight, and I heard Ray cursing as he fought to maintain his balance. "Don't look down, just keep moving." I focused on his voice, on putting one foot in front of the other, trying to ignore the way the wood flexed and groaned with each step. Behind me, I could hear the creatures moving along the edge of the ravine, pacing us, their calls taking on what sounded almost like laughter. Ray reached the far side and turned to help me across the final few feet. His face was pale but determined, and seeing him there gave me the strength to push through my terror and complete the crossing. We collapsed on solid ground, gasping and shaking. Across the ravine, the creatures had gathered at the edge, watching us with those predatory grins, but they made no attempt to follow. "Why aren't they coming after us?" Ray panted. I stared at the things across the gap, counting at least 7 of them now. They seemed patient, unhurried, as if they knew something we didn't. That's when I realized the truth that made my blood freeze. They weren't trying to catch us. They were hurting us. The realization hit me like a physical blow. We weren't escaping. We were being driven exactly where they wanted us to go. The creatures across the ravine continued their patient vigil, confirming my worst fears. This was all part of their plan. "Ray," I said quietly, struggling to keep my voice steady. "We need to think about this. They could have caught us back there, but they didn't. They're pushing us somewhere specific." Ray wiped sweat from his forehead, leaving a streak of dirt across his brow. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we're not running away from them. We're running toward something worse." The forest on this side of the ravine felt different, older. The trees were massive, their trunks scarred with what looked like claw marks that went back decades. Moss hung everywhere like funeral shrouds, and the air carried a stench of decay that made breathing unpleasant. But we had no choice except to keep moving. Behind us, the creatures had begun to make their way around the ravine. I could hear them calling to each other, coordinating their movements with disturbing intelligence. We followed what might have been an animal trail deeper into the ancient forest. Every step took us further from civilization, further from any hope of rescue. Our radios remained useless, producing only static and that strange scratching sound that seemed to mock our attempts at communication. "There," Ray whispered, pointing ahead. "Some kind of structure." Through the gaps in the trees, I could make out weathered wooden posts and what looked like the remains of a roof. As we got closer, I realized it was an old logging cabin, probably abandoned for 50 years or more. The walls were intact but covered in moss and decay, and the windows were dark holes that seemed to watch our approach. "Should we check it out?" Ray asked. "Maybe there's something we can use, supplies, another radio, a landline." I didn't like the idea of trapping ourselves in an enclosed space, but the cabin might offer temporary refuge while we figured out our next move, and Ray was right. Old logging operations sometimes maintained communication equipment that might still function. We approached the cabin carefully, listening for any sound from within. The door hung open on rusted hinges, creaking softly in the breeze. I peered inside and saw a single room filled with rotting furniture and debris. But there was something else. Scratches on the walls, similar to the marks we'd seen on the trees, but deeper and more deliberate. "Someone's been here recently," I said, pointing to fresh boot prints in the dust on the floor. Ray examined the prints. "These look official, heavy treads, probably Park Service or law enforcement, but they're at least a week old." We searched the cabin quickly but found nothing useful. No radio, no phone, no supplies. Just more of those disturbing claw marks and a smell that reminded me of rotting meat. But there was something else, something that made my skin crawl. Photographs, dozens of them, pinned to the walls and scattered across a moldering table. All showed the same subject. The creatures we'd encountered, but in different locations, different seasons. Some of the photos looked recent, taken with digital cameras. Others were older, faded Polaroids that must have been decades old. "Jesus," Ray breathed, examining a particularly clear image that showed one of the creatures crouched over what looked like human remains. Someone's been tracking these things for years. I picked up a photo that made my blood run cold. It showed the same clearing where we'd found Jessica and Michael's campsite, but the image was date-stamped from 6 months ago. In it, 3 of the creatures were feeding on something that had once been human. They have a pattern, I said, studying the collection of photographs. They hunt in this area regularly, and someone's been documenting it. Ray found a notebook buried under the photos, its pages water-damaged but still readable. The handwriting was small and cramped, filled with observations and theories about the creature's behavior. Day 47. Observed hunting pack behavior. They coordinate attacks using subsonic calls below human hearing range. Intelligence level appears higher than initially estimated. Day 52. Found remains of Portland hiking group. Same pattern, psychological torture before physical attack. They seem to feed on fear as much as flesh. Day 63. Attempted to track them to their lair. Found system of caves approximately 2 miles north of Timber Creek. Do not attempt to enter alone. Counted at least 20 individuals. The entries went on for months, documenting a systematic study of the creatures, but the final entry, dated just 2 weeks ago, made my hands shake. Day 127. They know I'm watching them. Found my old camp destroyed, equipment scattered, had to abandon research. If anyone finds this notebook, do not attempt to hunt these things. They're too intelligent, too organized. Call in military support, or better yet, evacuate the entire forest and carpet bomb the area. These things cannot be allowed to spread. Ray, I said, my voice hoarse, we need to get out of here, now. But when I looked up, Ray was gone. I spun around the small cabin, panic rising in my throat. The door was still open, the forest beyond, silent and still. No sound of struggle, no cry for help. He had simply vanished. Ray, I called out, then immediately regretted making noise. If the creatures had taken him, shouting would only bring them back for me. I grabbed the notebook and stuffed it into my jacket, then carefully approached the cabin door. The boot prints Ray had been examining were still there, but now there was something else, a new set of tracks leading away from the cabin. These weren't human. The prints were enormous, easily twice the size of a man's foot, with what looked like claw marks at the tips of each toe. They led directly into the darkest part of the forest, toward what the notebook had called their lair. I had a choice to make. I could try to find my way back to the ravine, attempt to reach civilization and call for backup. Or I could follow those tracks and try to rescue Ray, knowing it was almost certainly a trap. The decision was made for me when I heard Ray's voice calling from somewhere in the forest ahead. He sounded terrified, desperate, begging for help. But there was something wrong with his voice, a quality that made my skin crawl, as if it wasn't quite human anymore. I remembered reading about creatures that could mimic human voices, luring rescuers into ambushes. But what if it really was Ray? What if he was still alive, still savable? I followed the tracks deeper into the forest, my service pistol drawn and ready. Every shadow seemed to hide watching eyes. Every sound made me flinch and spin around. The trees grew larger and more twisted as I went deeper, their branches forming a canopy so thick that it was like walking through a twilight world. Ray's voice continued to call out, always just ahead, always out of sight. But the tone was changing, becoming less human, more predatory. Whatever was making those sounds was enjoying the game, savoring my fear and desperation. The tracks led to the mouth of a cave system carved into a hillside. The opening was huge, easily 20 feet across, with smaller passages branching off into darkness. And from somewhere deep within came the sound of movement, lots of movement, as if dozens of large creatures were stirring in the depths. Ray's voice called out from inside the cave, but now I could tell it wasn't really him. The pitch was wrong, the inflection off, like a recording played through damaged speakers. They had captured Ray, learned his voice, and were using it to lure me into their lair. I stood at the cave mouth, weighing my options. Going in was suicide. I'd be trapped in their territory, outnumbered and outmatched. But leaving Ray to whatever fate awaited him in those tunnels was something I couldn't live with. That's when I noticed something that changed everything. Fresh tire tracks in the mud outside the cave. Recent ones, made by heavy vehicles, possibly military or law enforcement. And scattered around the cave entrance were items that definitely didn't belong. Spent shell casings, fragments of body armor, what looked like part of a tactical radio. Someone else had been here recently, and they'd brought serious firepower. I followed the tire tracks away from the cave, moving as quietly as possible. They led to a temporary camp hidden in a grove of trees about half a mile from the cave system. Canvas shelters, military-grade equipment, and enough weapons to outfit a small army. But the camp was empty, abandoned. And from the state of the equipment, scattered, damaged, covered in those familiar claw marks, whoever had been here had met the same fate as everyone else who ventured into these woods. I was examining a damaged radio when I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, gun raised, and found myself face to face with a figure in military fatigues. But something was wrong with him. His movements were too fluid, his smile too wide, and when he spoke, it was with Ray's voice. "Marcus, thank God you found me. We need to get out of here right now." But it wasn't Ray. The face was right. The voice was right. But the eyes belonged to something else entirely. Something that had been studying me, learning me, preparing to replace me just as it had replaced my partner. I pulled the trigger without hesitation. The thing wearing Ray's face crumpled to the ground, black ichor spreading from the bullet wound in its chest. But even as it died, it kept smiling, kept speaking in my partner's voice. "You can't kill us all, Marcus. We're everywhere now. We're everyone you've ever trusted." I put 2 more bullets into its head before the voice finally stopped. The body began to change immediately, reverting to something pale and twisted that bore no resemblance to the man I'd worked with for 3 years. But the worst part was the realization that this thing had been studying Ray, learning his mannerisms, preparing to take his place in the world. How many others had they replaced? How far had this infection spread? I searched the abandoned military camp more thoroughly, looking for clues about who these people were and what they'd discovered. Most of the equipment was standard issue, but I found documents that made my blood run cold. Operation Clearcut, a joint task force between the FBI, CDC, and something called the Department of Anomalous Phenomena. According to the files, the creatures had been contained to this forest for decades, monitored and studied in secret. But something had changed recently. They were becoming more aggressive, more organized, and worst of all, they were learning to mimic human form perfectly. The final report, dated just 3 days ago, was stamped with red letters. Containment breach, immediate evacuation recommended. They'd tried to eliminate the creatures with conventional weapons and failed. The things were too smart, too adaptable, and now the military team was gone, either dead or replaced by those perfect mimics. I found a satellite phone among the scattered equipment and tried to call for backup, but got only static. The creatures were jamming communications somehow, keeping their hunting ground isolated from the outside world. But I did find something useful, a detailed map of the cave system, marked with the locations of what the researchers called breeding chambers. If Ray was still alive, still human, that's where I'd find him. The caves went deeper than I'd imagined, a vast network of tunnels and chambers that honeycombed the entire mountainside. According to the map, the main nest was almost a mile underground, accessible through several different entrances, but heavily guarded by the creatures. I equipped myself with as much military gear as I could carry, night vision goggles, body armor, extra ammunition, and several grenades that I hoped I wouldn't need to use. Then I made my way back to the cave entrance, trying to formulate some kind of plan that didn't end with my death. The tunnel sloped steeply downward, carved from solid rock by something that definitely hadn't used conventional tools. The walls were scored with those familiar claw marks, and the air grew thicker and more fetid with each step I took into the darkness. My night vision revealed a nightmare landscape of organic structures growing from the cave walls, things that looked like cocoons or egg sacs, pulsing with their own internal light. And everywhere, bones, human bones, picked clean and arranged in elaborate patterns that suggested ritual or ceremony. I followed the main tunnel for what felt like hours, guided by the military map and the increasing intensity of the stench. The creatures were down here somewhere, lots of them, but they seemed content to let me penetrate deeper into their domain. Just like before, they were herding me toward something specific. The tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber, larger than a cathedral. And hanging from the ceiling, wrapped in silken cocoons, were the missing people. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Some of the cocoons were old, their occupants long dead, but others were fresh. I could see movement inside them, hear muffled sounds of distress. The creatures were keeping them alive for some purpose I didn't want to contemplate. And there, hanging about 20 feet above the cavern floor, was Ray. He was conscious, his eyes wide with terror as he struggled against the silk bonds. When he saw me, he tried to call out, but the webbing covered his mouth. Still, I could see the relief in his expression. He knew I'd come for him, but getting to him would be the challenge. The cavern floor was covered with those creatures, at least 30 of them, all variations on the same nightmarish theme. They moved with purpose, tending to their human harvest, like farmers checking their crops. I needed a distraction, something to draw them away from Ray long enough for me to cut him down and get out of here. The grenades would create chaos, but they might also bring down the ceiling and kill everyone in the process. That's when I noticed something that changed my understanding of everything I'd seen. The creatures weren't just keeping people alive as food sources. They were changing them. Some of the cocoons contained figures that were no longer entirely human, elongated limbs, pale skin, faces that were shifting toward that familiar predatory grin. The creatures were converting their captives, turning them into more of their own kind, and some of the conversions were nearly complete. A cocoon near the edge of the chamber split open, and something that had once been human dropped to the cavern floor. It moved with that same fluid grace I'd seen in the mature creatures, but retained enough human features that I could tell it had been a woman, probably young, maybe a hiker who'd gone missing months ago. She looked up at the other captives with hungry eyes, already learning to see them as prey rather than fellow victims. The transformation was as much psychological as physical. Whatever process they used didn't just change the body, it rewrote the mind. Ray had seen it too. His struggles became more desperate, and I could see the panic in his eyes as he realized what fate awaited him if I didn't act soon. I pulled the pin from my first grenade and threw it toward the far side of the chamber. The explosion lit up the cavern like daylight, and the creatures shrieked in pain and rage as debris rained down on them. In the chaos that followed, I ran toward Ray's position, firing at anything that moved. The creatures were fast, but they weren't expecting a direct assault. I managed to reach the wall beneath Ray and started climbing the rough rock face, using the claw marks as handholds. Below me, the creatures were regrouping, their initial surprise replaced by coordinated hunting behavior. I reached Ray just as the first creature started climbing after me. My knife cut through the silk bindings and Ray dropped into my arms, gasping for breath as the webbing fell away from his face. "Marcus," he croaked, his voice hoarse from hours of muffled screaming. "They're not just here. They're everywhere. I heard them talking. They've got people in town, in the government, in the police force. This isn't just a local problem anymore." I helped him down from the wall as more creatures began scaling the rock face toward us. We had maybe 30 seconds before they reached us, and the only exit was back through the tunnel we'd entered. But Ray grabbed my arm, stopping me from heading toward the entrance. "There's another way out," he said. I heard them discussing it while they were preparing me. "There's a passage that leads to an old mine shaft about 2 miles from here. We can follow it to the surface, avoid their main hunting grounds. Can you walk? I'll have to." We ran toward the passage Ray had indicated, creatures dropping from the ceiling around us like predatory spiders. My second grenade bought us enough time to reach the tunnel, but I could hear them following, their calls echoing through the passages, coordinating their pursuit. The tunnel Ray had found was older than the others, carved by human hands rather than creature claws. It sloped gradually upward, and after what felt like hours of desperate flight through the darkness, we finally saw light ahead. We emerged from an abandoned mine entrance on the far side of the mountain, miles from where we'd started our search. The afternoon sun had never looked so beautiful, and the simple act of breathing clean air felt like a miracle. But our relief was short-lived. Ray was changing. I noticed it first in his eyes. They were becoming larger, more reflective. His skin had taken on a pale, waxy quality, and when he smiled, I caught a glimpse of teeth that were definitely not human anymore. "Ray," I said quietly, backing away from him. "When did they take you? How long were you in that cocoon?" He tilted his head with that same predatory curiosity I'd seen in the creatures. "Long enough, Marcus. Long enough to understand what we really are. What we're meant to become." The transformation was accelerating now that he was free of the cocoon. His limbs were elongating, his face reshaping itself into something hungry and alien. But worst of all, he was still talking in his familiar voice, still using the mannerisms and speech patterns that had made him my friend. You can't fight evolution, Marcus. They're not invaders. They're the next step. And soon, everyone will understand. Everyone will join us. I raised my pistol, but hesitated. Some part of me still hoped that Ray was in there somewhere, still fighting the change. But when he lunged at me with inhuman speed and strength, I pulled the trigger. Ray's body crumpled to the ground, already reverting to its alien form as the transformation completed itself in death. I stood over my partner's corpse, realizing that the man I'd known was probably gone long before I'd found him in that cavern. The notebook I'd taken from the cabin was still in my jacket. I pulled it out and read the final entry again, understanding now why the researcher had recommended military intervention. This wasn't just about a few monsters in the woods. This was an invasion, a slow-motion conquest that had been going on for decades. And if Ray was right, if they really had infiltrated human society, then it might already be too late. I needed to reach civilization, needed to warn someone who might actually be able to do something about this threat. But as I looked down at Ray's alien corpse, I realized the terrible truth. How could I tell who was human and who was merely pretending to be? The sun was setting by the time I reached the main road, painting the forest in shades of red that reminded me too much of blood. I'd been walking for 3 hours, following old logging roads and game trails, trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and that nightmare underground. My radio finally crackled to life as I got closer to civilization, but the voices I heard made my blood freeze. Search teams report no sign of Bennett or Sullivan, came the familiar voice of dispatch. Extend search perimeter to include the northern ridgeline. It was Sarah Martinez, the dispatcher I'd worked with for years. But there was something wrong with her cadence, a subtle difference in inflection that made my skin crawl. She sounded like Sarah, but underneath was something else, something that was trying very hard to sound human. I switched off the radio and kept walking. If they'd gotten to Sarah, who else had been replaced? How long had this been going on? The thought that I might have been working alongside these things for months or even years made my stomach churn. A Park Service vehicle approached from ahead, slowing as it recognized me walking along the roadside. Through the windshield I could see Tom Bradley, the veteran ranger who'd briefed us that morning. Was it really just this morning? It felt like a lifetime ago. The truck pulled over, and Tom leaned out the window with obvious relief. "Marcus, thank God. We've been looking everywhere for you and Ray. What happened out there?" I studied his face carefully, looking for any sign of the subtle wrongness I'd learned to recognize. Tom looked normal, sounded normal, but so had the thing wearing Ray's face. "Ray's dead," I said simply, watching Tom's reaction. His expression crumpled with genuine grief, or what looked like genuine grief. "Jesus, how? Was it an animal attack?" "Something like that." I climbed into the passenger seat, keeping my hand near my weapon. "Tom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Of course." "Have you noticed anything different about people lately? Anyone acting strangely, saying things they wouldn't normally say?" Tom's eyes narrowed. "What kind of different?" I told him everything. The creatures in the forest, the underground nest, the military operation that had failed to contain them, Ray's transformation, and most importantly, the evidence that they could perfectly mimic human beings. Tom listened without interruption, his expression growing more troubled with each detail. When I finished, he sat in silence for a long moment, staring out at the darkening forest. "I was afraid something like this might be happening," he said finally. "There have been incidents. People going missing and then turning up days later with no memory of where they'd been. Hikers reporting encounters with things that shouldn't exist. And you're right about people acting strangely. I've noticed it too, especially in the last few months." "Who?" I asked. "Sarah Martinez, for one. She's been different since she came back from that sick leave last month. More distant, asking strange questions about our protocols and procedures. And there are others, park employees, local police, even some folks in town." The implications were staggering. If the creatures had been systematically replacing key personnel in the area, they could control information flow, manipulate investigations, and ensure that their activities remained hidden from outside scrutiny. "We need to contact federal authorities," I said. "FBI, CDC, military, someone with the resources to deal with this." Tom nodded, but his expression was grim. "The question is, who can we trust? If they've infiltrated local law enforcement and park service, what's to say they haven't reached higher levels?" It was a chilling thought. The creatures had shown remarkable intelligence and patience. If they'd been operating for decades, they could have people placed throughout the government, the military, anywhere they needed influence. We drove toward town in tense silence, both of us scanning the roadside for any sign of movement. The forest looked different now, not peaceful and majestic, but predatory, full of watching eyes and hidden threats. "There's something else," Tom said as we approached the outskirts of the small mountain community. "I've been keeping records of missing persons cases in the area going back 20 years. The pattern is disturbing." He pulled a folder from under his seat and handed it to me. Inside were dozens of case files, each documenting the disappearance of hikers, campers, and local residents. But what made my hands shake was the pattern Tom had highlighted. Every few months, someone would go missing. Then, weeks or sometimes months later, they would reappear with no memory of where they'd been. Medical examinations always showed them to be in perfect health, but families and friends would report subtle changes in personality and behavior. "They've been building their infiltration network for 2 decades, I said, understanding the scope of what we were facing. Taking people, converting them, sending them back to blend into society. And now they're accelerating the process. In the last 6 months, we've had more disappearances than in the previous 5 years combined." We reached the town limits as full darkness fell. The streetlights cast pools of yellow light that seemed inadequate against the surrounding darkness, and I found myself scrutinizing every person we passed, wondering which ones were still human. Tom parked in front of the sheriff's station but made no move to get out of the truck. "Problem is, I don't trust Sheriff Morrison either," he said quietly. "He's been different since his fishing trip last spring, more methodical, like he's following a script. Then who can we trust?" "I don't know, but I have an idea." Tom reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a small digital camera. "I've been documenting some of the strange things I've observed. Photographs, video recordings, notes. If we can get this evidence to the right people, maybe we can convince someone to take action." He showed me images on the camera's LCD screen, creatures moving through the forest at night, caught in the infrared flash. Shots of people in town who showed subtle but unmistakable signs of transformation, and most damning of all, video footage of what looked like a town meeting where half the attendees moved with that same fluid grace I'd learned to recognize. "My God," I breathed. "How many of them are there?" "In town? Maybe a third of the population, possibly more. They're concentrated in positions of authority: police, government, medical personnel, anyone who could influence or control the community." The scope of the infiltration was overwhelming. This wasn't just a handful of monsters in the woods. It was a coordinated takeover of an entire community, and possibly just the beginning of something much larger. "We need to leave," I said. "Get to the nearest major city. Find federal agents who couldn't possibly have been compromised." Tom nodded, but as he started the engine, we heard the wail of sirens approaching from multiple directions. Red and blue lights flashed in our mirrors as police cruisers converged on our location. "Shit," Tom muttered. "They know we're here." The first cruiser pulled up behind us, trapping us against the sheriff's station. I could see the silhouette of the driver, but something about the way he sat, the angle of his head, looked wrong. More vehicles arrived. Sheriff's deputies, Park Service rangers, even what looked like federal agents in unmarked cars. But I was beginning to doubt that any of them were actually human. "Tom," I said quietly, "do you have another way out of town? Back roads? Forest Service routes, anything they might not know about?" "There's an old fire road that connects to the interstate about 20 miles north, but we'd have to get past them first." The officers were getting out of their vehicles now, moving with that coordinated precision I'd seen in the creatures. They surrounded our truck but made no immediate attempt to approach. Just like in the forest, they seemed content to wait, to savor our fear. Sheriff Morrison walked up to Tom's window, his familiar face wearing an expression of concern that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Tom, Marcus," he said in a voice that sounded exactly like the sheriff I'd known for years. "We've been looking for you. There are reports of dangerous animals in the area. We need to get you somewhere safe." But I could see the lie in his eyes, the predatory hunger that no amount of acting could completely hide. "We're fine, Sheriff," Tom replied. "Just heading home." "I'm afraid I can't let you do that. Not until we've had a chance to debrief you about what you encountered out there. For your own safety, of course." The thing wearing Sheriff Morrison's face smiled, but the expression was too wide, too knowing. It understood that we knew what it was, and it was enjoying the game. "Tom," I whispered, "on my signal, floor it." He nodded almost imperceptibly, his hand tightening on the steering wheel. The sheriff leaned closer to the window, and I could smell that familiar stench of decay emanating from his apparently human form. "Now!" I shouted. Tom gunned the engine, tires squealing as we shot forward between two parked cruisers. The officers, or things wearing officers' faces, scattered with inhuman speed and agility, but made no attempt to stop us with gunfire. They wanted us alive. We raced through the town's empty streets, Tom taking turns at dangerous speeds as we headed for the old fire road he'd mentioned. Behind us, sirens wailed as the entire compromised law enforcement apparatus gave chase. "There!" Tom pointed to a gap in the trees barely wide enough for our truck. "That's the fire road." We plunged into the forest, branches scraping against the windows as we followed the narrow, winding track. The headlights illuminated a nightmare landscape of twisted trees and hanging moss, and I caught glimpses of pale figures moving between the trunks, pacing our escape. They were everywhere. The entire forest was alive with them, and we were driving deeper into their territory with every mile. "Tom," I said, studying the fuel gauge, "we're not going to make it to the interstate on what we have left. I know a place we can stop for gas, old ranger station about 10 miles ahead. It's been abandoned for years, but I keep supplies there for emergencies." The fire road seemed to go on forever, winding through increasingly dense forest. Our pursuers had fallen back, but I could still hear their calls echoing through the trees, that same inhuman communication I'd heard in the cave system. We reached the abandoned ranger station just as the fuel gauge hit empty. The building was dark and overgrown, but Tom led me to a concealed fuel depot behind the structure. As he worked to fill the tank, I kept watch for any sign of pursuit. The forest around us was silent, but it felt like the silence of predators waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "Almost done," Tom muttered, wrestling with the old pump. That's when I saw the lights approaching through the trees. Not the harsh glare of headlights, but the softer illumination of flashlights and lanterns. They were coming on foot, moving through the forest with the patience of experienced hunters. "We need to go, now." Tom finished fueling the truck, and we climbed back in, but as he turned the key, the engine coughed and died. He tried again. Nothing. "They've sabotaged something," he said, popping the hood. In the beam of his flashlight, I could see severed wires and damaged components. "We're not driving out of here." The lights were getting closer, and I could make out figures moving between the trees. Dozens of them, all wearing the faces of people I'd known and trusted. "The radio tower," Tom said suddenly. "There's an old emergency transmitter up on the ridge. If we can reach it, we might be able to get word out." It was a slim hope, but better than waiting here to be captured. We gathered what supplies we could carry and headed up the steep trail toward the ridge, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. Behind us, the forest filled with those hunting calls as our pursuers closed in. The climb seemed endless, our lungs burning in the thin mountain air. Several times I heard movement in the trees around us, but when I turned my light toward the sounds, I saw only shadows and twisted branches. We reached the radio tower just as dawn began to break over the mountains. The old emergency transmitter was still functional, powered by solar panels and a backup battery system. Tom worked frantically to establish contact while I kept watch on the trail below. "Mayday, mayday," Tom spoke into the microphone. "This is Ranger Station 47, requesting immediate federal assistance. We have a biological contamination event in progress, multiple civilian casualties, need immediate military intervention." Static filled the speaker, then a familiar voice responded, Tom, this is dispatch. We've been looking for you. What's your location? It was Sarah Martinez again, that same false concern in her voice. They're monitoring all frequencies, I said. We can't trust anyone. But Tom had an idea. He switched to an emergency frequency used by the military, one that civilian agencies wouldn't normally monitor. Any station, any station. This is Cascade National Forest requesting immediate assistance. We have confirmation of hostile biological entities. Request immediate sterilization protocol for grid reference. He rattled off coordinates that encompassed the entire infected area. The response came after several tense minutes in a crisp military voice I didn't recognize. Cascade Station. This is Colonel James Mitchell, Joint Chiefs Biological Response Team. We copy your transmission and are aware of the situation. Extraction team en route to your position, ETA 30 minutes. Maintain your position and avoid contact with any unidentified personnel. Relief flooded through me. Someone in the military knew about the threat and was taking action. How did they know? I asked. Tom looked grim. Remember that failed military operation I found evidence of? They probably have contingency plans in place. This might not be the first outbreak they've dealt with. We waited on the ridge as the sun climbed higher, watching the forest below for any sign of our pursuers. The creatures seemed to have pulled back, perhaps sensing that external forces were about to intervene. Right on schedule, we heard the sound of helicopters approaching from the east. 3 military choppers crested the ridge and circled our position, then one touched down while the others provided cover. Soldiers in full hazmat gear emerged from the aircraft, their faces hidden behind reflective visors. One of them approached with a scanner of some kind, running it over both Tom and me before giving an all-clear signal. Are you the ones who made the emergency transmission? The soldier's voice was muffled by his protective gear. Yes, Tom replied. We have evidence of extensive biological contamination, hostile entities that can mimic human form. The entire area needs to be quarantined. The soldier nodded. We know. This situation has been escalating for weeks. You're lucky to have survived this long. As we climbed aboard the helicopter, I looked down at the forest one last time. It looked peaceful in the morning light, beautiful even, but I knew the truth of what lurked beneath that green canopy. What happens now? I asked the soldier. Containment, he replied. Full sterilization of the infected zone. We can't let this spread any further. As the helicopter lifted off, I saw other aircraft approaching from the horizon, bombers flying in formation, carrying enough ordnance to level the entire forest. But even as we flew toward safety, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were too late. The creatures had been spreading for decades, infiltrating communities, replacing key personnel. How many other forests harbored similar infestations? How many towns had already been compromised? The war for humanity's survival had begun, and I wasn't sure we were winning. 3 months later, I testified before a closed congressional committee about what I'd witnessed in the Cascade National Forest. The official story was a terrorist biological weapon test that had been successfully contained. The forest remained off-limits, designated as a permanent environmental hazard zone. But I knew the truth was more complex. The creatures had been too organized, too intelligent to be completely eradicated by conventional weapons. Some had undoubtedly escaped the bombing, gone deeper underground, or fled to other territories, and sometimes late at night I got reports from other search and rescue teams in other forests. Stories that sounded all too familiar. Missing hikers, strange tracks, people who came back changed. The infection was spreading, and I was one of the few people who knew what to look for. I transferred to a desk job, but I kept in touch with search and rescue teams across the country, building a network of people who could recognize the signs. We called ourselves the Watchers, and our job was to identify new outbreaks before they could spread. Because the truth is, the forest is patient. It's been here longer than humanity, and it's willing to wait as long as necessary to reclaim what it considers its own. And late at night, when the wind blows through the trees outside my window, I can almost hear them calling. Those voices that sound almost human, but not quite. They're still out there. Still hunting, still learning, and they're getting better at pretending to be us. The rental car's engine ticked as it cooled in the mountain air, the only sound breaking the oppressive quiet of the Cascade wilderness. I stood beside our dusty Honda, staring at the trail marker that read Kia Lake, 8.2 miles, in faded government lettering. The wooden sign looked older than it should have, weathered by decades of harsh winters. "This is it?" Brianna asked, her Australian accent cutting through the stillness as she shouldered her pack. She'd flown in from Perth specifically for this trip, something she'd been planning since we'd reconnected online 2 years ago. "Looks properly remote." "That's the point," replied Marcus, adjusting his worn baseball cap. My old college roommate had driven down from Vancouver with enough camping gear to stock a small expedition. 3 weeks off-grid. No cell towers, no tourists, no distractions. I checked my phone one last time. No signal, as expected. The last bar had disappeared 20 miles back on the Forest Service road. We were committed now. The trail began innocuously enough, winding through second-growth timber and patches of late-season wildflowers. But as we climbed higher, the forest changed. The trees grew taller and closer together, their canopy thickening until only scattered beams of afternoon sunlight reached the forest floor. The temperature dropped noticeably, and our breath began to mist. After 4 hours of steady hiking, we reached Kia Lake. The body of water stretched before us like black glass, perfectly still and reflecting the surrounding peaks. On the far shore sat a small log cabin, exactly where the Forest Service map indicated. But something felt wrong about the scene, though I couldn't articulate what. "Beautiful," Brianna whispered, but her voice carried an odd tension. Marcus was already studying his GPS unit, frowning. "That's weird. According to this, we're not where we should be." "Technology fails out here all the time," I said, though his words sent an uncomfortable flutter through my stomach. "The trees mess with satellite signals." We made our way around the lake's edge, following what appeared to be an old game trail. The cabin, as we approached, revealed itself to be in better condition than expected. Someone had maintained it recently. The windows were intact, the roof showed no signs of damage, and the door hung straight on its hinges. "Lucky us," Marcus said, testing the door. It opened with a rusty creak, beats sleeping in tents. Inside, the cabin was sparse but functional. 2 bunk beds, a stone fireplace, and a simple kitchen area with a hand pump for water. Everything was clean, as if someone had just left. Too clean. "Check this out," Brianna called from near the fireplace. She was holding a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. "Looks like a guest book." I took it from her and flipped through the entries. Most were standard hiking notes, dates, weather conditions, wildlife sightings. But as I read deeper, certain entries made me pause. July 15th, 1987. Something watches from the tree line at night. Doesn't look right. Leaving early. September 3rd, 1994. The howling isn't wolves. Jimmy swears he saw it walk upright. We're staying in the cabin tonight. May 22nd, 2003. It came to the window. Looked like my brother, but wrong. So wrong. Don't trust anything that calls your name after dark. "What's it say?" Marcus asked, but I closed the journal quickly. Just typical hiker stuff, weather reports and such. We spent the remainder of daylight organizing our supplies and exploring the immediate area. The lake was deeper than it appeared, its bottom lost in inky blackness just a few feet from shore. No fish rose to disturb the surface. No insects buzzed over the water. Even the expected sounds of forest life seemed muted here. As darkness fell, we built a fire in the stone hearth and prepared our first meal. The cabin's interior felt warmer with the flames dancing, but the windows now reflected our movements like dark mirrors. I found myself avoiding looking at them directly. "So, what's the plan for tomorrow?" Brianna asked, settling into one of the lower bunks with her tea. "I want to explore the North Ridge," I said, consulting our topographic map. "There are supposed to be some interesting geological formations up there." Marcus nodded from where he sat, cleaning his camera equipment. "I'll come with you. This light will be perfect for photography." "I might stay closer to the lake," Brianna said. "Do some sketching, maybe fish if there are any." Outside, something howled. The sound was distant but wrong somehow, too long, too human-like at the end. We all froze, listening. The howl came again, closer this time, and was answered by another from across the lake. Wolves? Marcus asked quietly. Maybe, I replied, though every instinct told me otherwise. We should keep the fire going tonight. We took turns feeding wood to the flames, none of us sleeping particularly well. Each time the fire died down, shadows seemed to press closer to the windows. Several times I thought I heard footsteps circling the cabin, but when I looked out, I saw only darkness. Near dawn, Brianna shook me awake from my position in the chair by the fire. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I listened. Somewhere outside, a voice was calling my name. It sounded like Marcus, but Marcus was asleep in the bunk across from us, snoring softly. The voice came again, more insistent. My name, drawn out like a question, seeming to come from just beyond the tree line. "Don't answer," I whispered back, remembering the journal entry. "Don't even look." We sat in silence until full daylight, feeding the fire and waiting. The calling eventually stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been testing us, learning our voices, our patterns of response. When Marcus finally woke, he seemed refreshed and eager to begin exploring. But I noticed he kept glancing toward the windows, as if he too had heard something during the night. The morning felt different. The oppressive stillness had lifted slightly, replaced by normal forest sounds, bird calls, rustling leaves, the distant splash of something in the lake. It should have been reassuring, but instead it felt like a performance, as if the wilderness was trying too hard to appear normal. Marcus and I set out after breakfast, leaving Brianna at the cabin with her sketchbook and fishing gear. The trail to the north ridge was barely visible, more of a deer path than anything humans had used recently. As we climbed, the trees thinned slightly, allowing more sunlight to filter through. "This place has a weird vibe," Marcus said, adjusting his camera strap. "Like it's watching us." I nodded, relieved he felt it too. The local tribes considered this area sacred, off-limits to most people. Sacred how? Boundary place, where the spirit world and physical world touch. I paused to catch my breath. My grandmother was part Paiute. She told stories about places like this, said some things are better left undisturbed. Marcus stopped walking. "Your grandmother never mentioned that before." "You never asked." But even as I said it, something felt strange about the words, like they weren't entirely mine. We reached the ridge after 2 hours of steady climbing. The view was spectacular, miles of untouched wilderness stretching in every direction, with Kia Lake far below looking like a dark jewel set among the trees. Marcus immediately began photographing, moving around to capture different angles. I found myself drawn to a collection of stones arranged in what appeared to be deliberate patterns, not quite a circle, but something more complex. The rocks were weathered smooth and showed signs of great age. When I knelt to examine them more closely, I noticed bones scattered among the stones, small ones, birds, rodents, but picked completely clean. "Marcus, look at this." But when I turned, he was gone. His camera lay on the ground near the edge of the ridge, lens cap off, as if he'd set it down mid-shot. I called his name, my voice echoing off the surrounding peaks. No response. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the mountain air. I approached the camera carefully and looked through the viewfinder. The last photo showed the view toward the lake, but in the frame, standing among the trees near the water's edge, was a figure that hadn't been visible to our naked eyes, tall, impossibly thin, watching the cabin where we'd left Brianna. I grabbed the camera and ran back down the trail, calling Marcus's name. My voice seemed to be absorbed by the forest, falling dead just yards from where I stood. The normal sounds had stopped again. Even my footsteps seemed muffled. Halfway back to the lake, I found Marcus's hat hanging from a branch at eye level. It hadn't been there on our way up. I was certain of that. But now it dangled like a marker, positioned exactly where someone my height would notice it. I broke into a run. The cabin came into view just as I heard Brianna scream. Not a startled cry, but pure terror. The sound of someone confronting something that shouldn't exist. I burst through the cabin door to find her pressed against the far wall, staring at one of the windows. "It was Marcus," she gasped. "But not Marcus. Wrong proportions. Too tall. It was wearing his clothes, but they didn't fit right." I looked where she was pointing. The window showed only forest, but the glass bore handprints on the outside, large with fingers too long to be human. "Where's the real Marcus?" she asked. I showed her the camera, explaining what I'd found on the ridge. Her face went pale as she looked at the photo. We need to leave. Now. We threw our essential gear into packs, abandoning most of our supplies. As we prepared to flee, I found myself drawn back to the journal. The entries I'd skipped earlier now seemed crucial. The Paiute called them those who walk between. Not spirits, not animals, but something else. They take what they need, appearance, voice, memories, but they never get it quite right. Always something wrong with the proportions, the movements, the eyes. If you see someone you know acting strangely, don't trust them. Test them with questions only they would know. And whatever you do, don't let them touch you. That's how the change happens. Outside, something called my name in Marcus's voice, but the tone was wrong, too flat, like a recording played at the wrong speed. "Don't answer," Brianna whispered, echoing my words from the night before. We slipped out the back of the cabin and made our way around the lake's edge, staying close to the tree line. The voice followed us, sometimes Marcus's, sometimes mine, calling to Brianna, always just wrong enough to make our skin crawl. At the trailhead, we found Marcus's pack. Inside, scattered among his clothes, were bones. Human bones, picked clean like those on the ridge, a wedding ring I recognized as belonging to a hiker who'd gone missing in this area 3 years ago. The voice was getting closer, more insistent. Now it sounded like both Marcus and myself talking in unison, a horrible harmony that made my teeth ache. We ran. The 8-mile hike out took us less than 3 hours, fueled by pure terror. We didn't stop until we reached the car, didn't look back until we were miles down the Forest Service road. In the rearview mirror, I thought I saw a tall figure standing at the trailhead, watching us leave. The police search for Marcus lasted 2 weeks. They found no trace of him, though they did discover the remains of several other missing hikers in caves near the ridge. The case was eventually classified as a wilderness accident, despite the lack of evidence. Brianna returned to Australia without speaking of what we'd experienced. We exchange emails occasionally, but never about that trip. Some things are better left in the silence of deep places. I never went back to Kia Lake, but sometimes, late at night, I'll get a phone call. No one speaks, but I can hear forest sounds in the background, wind through trees, the distant splash of something in dark water. And sometimes just before I hang up, I hear my own voice calling softly, asking me to come home. The rental car is still parked in my driveway. I haven't driven it since we returned. Every morning I check to make sure all the doors are locked because sometimes I find muddy handprints on the windows. Handprints with fingers just a little too long to be human. Marcus is still out there in a way. But what wears his face now isn't something I'd want to meet again in the dark spaces between the trees.